Chapter 1. The Land of Rivers and Reeds in the Cradle of the World, where the twin rivers Tigris and Euphrates dance through the earth. A silent miracle unfolded. The rivers, fierce and untamed, swept down from the mountains, carrying with them the stories of distant lands. But it was here, in the embrace of this fertile crescent, that they left their greatest gift, life, beneath the scorching sun. The rivers swelled and receded, leaving behind rich, dark soil. This earth, black with promise, whispered to the sky, and life answered. The first settlers came, drawn by the bounty of the rivers. They were wanderers no more, but dreamers of a new life. Their hands shaped mud into huts, their feet pressed paths into the soft ground. Small villages rose, each a cluster of homes hugged by the reeds that swayed in the warm breeze, but the rivers, generous yet wild, were not always kind. Their waters roared, flooding the fields, drowning the hopes of those who tilled the earth. The settlers learned they must tame the rivers or be swallowed by them. And so they dug, with bare hands and simple tools, carving canals to guide the waters. It was a fragile dance between survival and surrender, but in time they mastered the rhythm. Seasons passed, and where chaos once raged, order bloomed. Fields of wheat stretched to the horizon, their golden waves swaying like the hands of a grateful people. Date palms towered above, their sweet fruit a gift from the sky. In this land, the rivers carried more than just water. They carried the promise of abundance. Here, life did not merely survive, it flourished. As the sun sank beyond the plains, a hush would fall. Beneath the glow of a pale moon, the settlers gathered by the river banks. Children listened wide-eyed to the elders, who spoke of the gods, who lived within the water's spirits, who blessed the fields and cursed the unworthy. Civilization was stirring, not just in the soil, but in the hearts of those who had claimed this land. The rivers sang their eternal song, and with every drop, a new verse was written. This was not just a place of fields and reeds. It was a place of stories, a land where life had learned to rise from the mud, the first villages and gods in the shadows of swaying palms. The first villages appeared clusters of mud brick huts that seemed to grow from the earth itself. Each village was a world of its own, a sanctuary where life clung to the promise of the rivers. But beneath the simple roofs of thatch and clay, something profound stirred faith. The people of these villages were not just farmers and builders. They were dreamers who saw the world through sacred eyes. At dawn, they whispered prayers to the gods of the rivers, asking for gentle floods and bountiful harvests. At dusk, their songs rose to the heavens, carried on the soft breeze. The gods were everywhere, in the rustling reeds, in the whispering waters, in the stars that glittered above the endless plains. In the heart of each village stood a temple, though a simple one. Made of mud and thatch, it was a place where the earth touched the sky. Priests draped in simple robes moved through the shadows, their voices murmuring sacred words. They were the keepers of the unseen, the ones who spoke with the gods on behalf of the people. Smoke from sacred fires curled toward the heavens, a bridge between the world of men and the world of the divine. The gods were many, each a guardian of life's fragile balance. There was Enki, the god of the waters, who could bring life or death with the rise of the rivers. There was Anu, lord of the heavens, whose stars watched over the night. And Inanna, goddess of love and war, who stirred the hearts of men with dreams of passion and conquest. In this land of reeds and rivers, faith was not a choice, it was life itself, but faith was not just a comfort. It was a promise. When the floods came too fierce, the priests prayed harder, their chants rising with the waters. When the fields wilted beneath the merciless sun, offerings were laid at the temple doors, baskets of dates, clay jars of honey, the first sheaves of grain. The gods were not always kind, but they were always watching, and so the villages grew, not just in size, but in spirit. They were sanctuaries not only of clay, but of hope. Here, beneath the endless sky, the people learned to live not just by the rivers, but with them blessed and watched over by the ancient gods. The invention of writing time flowed like the rivers, and with it came change. The villages grew, their paths winding like the veins of the earth. Life became more than just survival, it became memory. But memory is a fragile thing, and even the stories of the elders began to fade like mist beneath the morning sun. Something had to be done. It began with marks pressed into soft, damp clay. Simple lines, at first a record of grains stored, a tally of sheep traded. But soon these marks became more. Scribes with steady hands and sharp reeds pressed their thoughts into the clay. Cuneiform, the world's first written language, was born. The scribes were the keepers of memory, the ones who turned whispers into words that could never be forgotten. Their tablets spoke of the harvests, of the prayers to the gods, of the deeds of kings who ruled with wisdom or cruelty. Each symbol was a promise that nothing would be lost, that stories would endure even when the tellers were gone. But writing was not just for trade or law. It was a gateway to the sacred. Priests carved hymns to the gods, their praises preserved for eternity. Poets wove tales of heroes and monsters, their voices carried through time. Even the names of the humble farmers, shepherds, weavers found their place in the damp clay, a reminder that they too are part of this grand story. The clay tablets dried beneath the sun, their marks hardened into permanence. They were not just records. They were whispers from the past, the silent voices of a people who had learned to speak beyond the bounds of life. In this land of rivers and reeds, words became more than sounds. They became eternal, the dawn of city-state change swept over the land like the winds of a coming storm. Villages, once humble and scattered, began to swell. Mud brick huts gave way to grander homes, fields stretched farther, and the horizon grew crowded with rooftops. These were no longer villages, they were cities. Uruk, the city of kings, rose like a jewel in the plains. Its walls, towering and proud, were a testament to the dreams of a people who had learned to tame the wild. Streets wound like rivers, crowded with merchants, priests, and warriors. Ziggurats' vast stepped temples soared toward the sky, their tops lost in the clouds. Here the gods watched, and the people prayed, but not all was peace. Ambition grew like weeds among the reeds. City vied against city, each seeking to claim the land and the favor of the gods. Lagash, Kish, names that would echo through time rose and fell in endless cycles of war and peace. The rivers, once a cradle of life, became the veins of empire, yet even in the shadow of towering walls, life continued. Farmers sowed their fields, scribes carved their words, priests whispered their prayers. The rivers flowed, indifferent to the rise and fall of kings, and through it all, the land of rivers and reeds endured, a place where dreams were born and stories were written in the soft, damp clay of time. Chapter 2. Uruk, the first great city, in the vast plains of Mesopotamia, where the two mighty rivers whispered secrets to the land, there rose a city like no other Uruk. A city of walls and wonder, its towering brick ramparts stood against the open sky, a fortress where life pulsed beneath the sun. It was a city not just of people, but of legends. And at the heart of these legends stood one name above all, Gilgamesh. They said Gilgamesh was not just a king, but a giant among men. Half god, half mortal, his strength was unmatched, his wisdom revered. His deeds were not whispered in shadows, but shouted from the rooftops. The people of Uruk saw him not merely as a ruler, but as a force of nature, a man who wrestled lions and walked with the gods. His name was a beacon, casting its light over the crowded streets, the bustling markets, and the quiet temples where prayers floated like incense. Yet beneath the grandeur of Gilgamesh, Uruk was more than just a king's city. It was a world in itself. Streets wound like veins through the earth, lined with humble huts and grand palaces. The scent of fresh-baked bread mixed with the fragrance of wildflowers from the fields beyond. Vendors called out, their voices mingling with the laughter of children and the steady hum of daily life. Life thrived here, sheltered by the mighty walls that stretched endlessly across the horizon. But even a city built by a god-king had its shadows. Beneath Gilgamesh's strength lay a restless spirit. He was a ruler who sought glory, a man who desired more than the simple peace of harvest and hearth. His people whispered of his fierce temper, his unending quests for fame, his hunger to carve his name into the very bones of history. Gilgamesh was a giant, but he was also a man, and it was this hunger that would drive him beyond the walls of Uruk, into the mists of legend. Uruk was his city, but it was more than just his. It was a place where the stories of 1,000 souls came together, weaving a tapestry of life of farmers who worked the fields, priests who sang to the heavens, merchants who traded beneath the burning sun. It was a city of dreams and fears, of whispered prayers and shouted triumphs. And at its heart, rising above the mud-brick homes and crowded squares, stood the ziggurat tower that touched the sky, a bridge between earth and the heavens, the sacred ziggurat shy above the noise and chaos of the streets. Where the dust of the earth met the light of the sky, there stood the sacred ziggurat of Uruk, a mountain of mud and brick that reached for the heavens. It was more than just a temple. It was the soul of the city, a place where the people of Uruk touched the divine, step by step. The ziggurat rose in massive, sun-baked layers, its broad terraces lined with lush gardens, where the breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. Priests in flowing robes climbed its sacred steps, their whispered prayers carried on the wind. Smoke from incense rose in soft spirals, reaching for the clouds, a silent message to the gods who watched from beyond the stars. At the very peak. In a chamber where the world felt distant and quiet was the shrine of Inanna, the goddess of love and war, the queen of heaven. Her statue, draped in silver and gold, gazed with calm eyes over her city. It was to her that the people brought their offerings, jars of honey, woven baskets of dates, shining silver trinkets, gifts meant to earn her favor, to seek her blessings. Kings came here, their heads bowed in humility, their grand ambitions laid bare before the goddess. Warriors prayed for victory in battle, mothers for the health of their children. The ziggurat was not just a place of worship. It was a place of dreams, a bridge between the earth and the sky, where the hopes of 1,000 souls rose like the morning mist. Yet, for all its glory, the ziggurat was a reminder of something more: the endless reach of humanity, the desire to touch the divine, to build towers that rose higher than the clouds, even though all men walked on the soil. It was a symbol of faith and ambition, a monument to the dreams of those who gazed at the stars but lived in the dust, a world of trade and craftsmanship. And in the shadow of the ziggurat, the streets of Uruk were a living river of life. Here, the scent of spices mingled with the cool aroma of wet clay, and the cries of merchants filled the air like the song of birds. Uruk was a city of trade, a crossroads of the world, where the hands of craftsmen turned simple earth into wonders. In crowded markets, merchants called out to passersby, their voices a vibrant chorus. Silver from distant mountains gleamed beneath the desert sun. Beads of lapis lazuli sparkled with the deep blue of twilight, and grain from the fertile fields of Mesopotamia changed hands in exchange for fine wool, sweet dates, and fragrant oils. This was the heartbeat of Uruk, a city where the world's riches flowed like the waters of the rivers. But it was not just wealth that gave Uruk its glory. It was the hands of its craftsmen. In quiet workshops, potters spun their wheels there, fingers shaping soft, wet clay into delicate bowls and sturdy jars. Jewelers bent over tiny gemstones, their tools clicking softly as they set silver into intricate designs. Weavers wove bright, colorful tapestries, their threads dancing with the colors of the sunset. Everywhere, life was a dance of creation. Masons stacked bricks to raise grand walls, sculptors carved the faces of gods into smooth stone, and carpenters shaped the wood of distant forests into graceful furniture. In Uruk, creation was a way of life, a testament to the skill and spirit of a people who could turn dust into beauty. Yet even as the city's wealth grew, its heart remained humble. Beneath the bright banners and the crowded streets, there was a quiet truth that each coin was earned by calloused hands, each jewel a gift of the earth. In Uruk, wealth was not just a treasure, it was a story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, but more than walls and trade, more than temples and wealth. It was in words that Uruk found its soul. For in the heart of this city, beneath the watchful eyes of its gods and kings, a story was born, a tale of friendship, courage, and the search for immortality. It was the Epic of Gilgamesh on damp clay tablets. Ancient scribes pressed sharp reeds, carving words that would outlast the city itself. They told of Gilgamesh, the mighty king who sought to defy death. They spoke of his friendship with Enkidu, a wild man tamed by the touch of love. They sang of their adventures slaying monsters, defying gods, and walking the path between life and death. But the epic was more than just a story of heroes. It was a mirror reflecting the hopes and fears of a people who lived beneath the shadow of death. In Gilgamesh's quest for immortality, they saw their own struggle, the desire to leave a mark, to be remembered when the rivers had changed their course and the walls had crumbled to dust. As the moon rose above the ziggurat, casting its silver light over the silent city, the scribes wrote by the glow of flickering lamps. Their tablets were soft clay, but their words were iron, a gift to the future, a promise that the dreams of Uruk would never fade. In the end, it was not the walls or the temples that made Uruk great. It was the story, the tale of a king who sought the meaning of life and found it not in power, but in friendship, in love, and in the gentle whisper of the stars. Uruk was more than just a city. It was a dream, written in clay, whispered in the wind. Chapter 3. Summer, the age of city-states. in the land of summer, beneath the burning sky of Mesopotamia, the earth was a patchwork of kingdoms. This was not a single, unified land, but a mosaic of city-states, each a world of its own. There was Yor, with its towering ziggurat, where the moon god Nana watched over his faithful. Lagash, a city of fierce warriors and proud kings. Umma, whose fields stretched wide beneath the gaze of the sun. And Eridu, the ancient home of Enki, god of wisdom and the deep waters. Each of these cities stood as a jewel in the desert, a beacon of life surrounded by the endless plains. They were islands of stone and clay, rising from the dust, their walls a shelter against the wildness of the world. Yet they were more than mere shelters. They were realms of power, places where men and gods walked side by side, or so the people believed. In each city, the kings ruled beneath the banners of their patron gods. They claimed divine right, speaking not just as men, but as chosen vessels of the divine. Their words were law, their wills unchallenged. To disobey the king was to defy the gods themselves. The people obeyed, not just out of fear, but out of faith. They saw their rulers as the bridge between heaven and earth, yet beneath the surface, peace was a fragile dream. Each city was proud. Each ruler saw himself as the chosen one, the favorite of the gods. In the bustling markets, merchants whispered of rivalries. In the shadowed temples, priests prayed for victory against their neighbors. The rivers that brought life to summer also carried whispers of envy and ambition, and so the fields of summer were fertile not just with crops, but with conflict. The same waters that fed the cities could become a battlefield, a river turned red beneath the blades of warring soldiers. The age of city-states was an age of splendor, but also an age of shadows. Beneath the blazing sun, in the narrow streets, and the vast fields, the seeds of war were already being sown. Priests and kings, the struggle for power in the shadow of the grand temples, a silent struggle brewed. Summer was a land of kings, but it was also a land of gods and those who claimed to speak for them. The kings of the city-states were crowns of silver and gold. Their chariots thundered through the streets. Their warriors marched beneath fluttering banners. But in the cool, incense-filled halls of the temples, another kind of power stirred. The priests were the keepers of the sacred, the voices of the gods. Draped in robes of white and blue, they walked with solemn grace, their foreheads marked with sacred symbols. To the people, they were the chosen ones, those who could whisper to the heavens and bring down blessings or curses. To the kings, they were both a blessing and a threat. For a time, there was balance. The kings ruled the land, wielding swords and commanding armies. The priests ruled the spirit, speaking with the voice of the gods. But power is a jealous thing. The kings began to see the temples not as sacred sanctuaries, but as fortresses of hidden power. And the priests, in turn, saw the kings not as chosen rulers, but as men with ambitions too vast for mortal souls. Whispers grew in the shadows. Some kings sought to control the temples, to appoint their own priests, to bend the will of the gods to their own desires. Others built new temples, grander and higher, as if to prove that their gods were greater than those of their neighbors. And the priests who once prayed for peace began to bless the swords of warriors, to anoint kings not just with sacred oil, but with divine right to conquer, a delicate balance, once held by faith, now hung by a thread of ambition. Kings and priests Warriors and sages all walked a narrow path, each seeking to stand above the others. And the land of summer, once a place of whispered prayers and silent sanctuaries, became a land of restless dreams and shadowed hearts, the wars of Lagash and Amain, the heart of summer, where the rivers whispered beneath the open sky. The fields became a place of blood. Two cities, two proud kingdoms, Lagash and Umma, stood as rivals, each claiming the fertile fields that stretched between them. Beneath the burning sun, the warriors marched, their banners snapping like thunder. In the wind, Lagash, proud and fierce, stood beneath the shadow of its mighty ziggurat. Its warriors were clad in bronze, their spears gleaming beneath the sun. The priests of Lagash spoke of divine favor, of Enlil's blessing upon their city. They saw themselves as chosen, a people whose strength was a gift from the heavens, Umma. Their rival was no less proud. Its fields were rich, its temples grand. Its warriors marched with the blessing of the sun god, Shamash, their blades sharp, their hearts fierce. To the people of Umma, the fields were not just a place of crops, but a birthright, a gift of the gods. To be defended with blood, war became a season in summer, as familiar as the rising of the rivers. Soldiers marched beneath banners of blue and gold, their spears glittering like stars. Bronze helmets shone, chariots thundered across the fields, and the cries of the dying rose like dark prayers to the sky. For years, Lagash and Umma clashed. One year, Lagash triumphed, its warriors returning with spoils of war, their priests singing hymns of victory. The next, Umma struck back, its soldiers sweeping across the fields, their king anointing his sword with the blood of his enemies. But, in the end, the fields of summer were soaked with more than blood. They were soaked with despair. Farmers who once plowed the rich soil now dug graves. Mothers wept in silent huts, their eyes fixed on empty doorways. The dream of unity of a land of peace beneath the gods lay broken beneath the dust of war. The rise of King Shapite from this chaos, something new began to stir. Beneath the shadow of war and the whispers of the temples, a new kind of king emerged, a king not just of swords, but of laws. A ruler who was more than a warlord, more than a priest's pawn. He was a protector, a guide, a father to his people. His name was Lugalzagasi of Umma, a man who saw beyond the smoke of battle, who dreamed of a land united not by blood, but by wisdom. He spoke not just of conquest, but of justice. His voice was calm, his words were law, and beneath his rule, the dream of unity stirred once more. Lugalzagasi's banners flew not just over Umma, but over the cities that had once stood against him. He did not merely conquer. He embraced. He stood in the temples, not as a priest, but as a protector. He spoke of the gods, but also of the people of their fields, their homes, their dreams. But even this dream was fragile. For power once tasted is never easily set aside. Lugalzagasi's name spread, his banners rose higher, his voice became a command. And the other kings watched with wary eyes, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords beneath the burning sky of summer. The land of city-states became a land of ambition. Kings dreamed of empires, priests whispered of divine favor, and the rivers flowed, silent and eternal. The age of city-states was fading, and a new age, an age of kings and empires, was dawning. But even as the shadows of ambition grew, there remained something that could not be crushed, the quiet hope of a people who looked to the heavens, who whispered prayers in the cool of the temples, and who saw, beyond the dust of war, the gentle light of the stars. Chapter 4. The Rise of Akkad Sargon's Empire in the Shadow of Kish. Beneath the wide-open sky of Mesopotamia, a river whispered its secrets. Its waters flowed gently, carrying reeds and dreams, but on one fateful day, they carried something more a tiny basket, adrift and alone. Inside that basket lay a child, a baby cradled by fate. His name was Sargon, born to a humble woman, a gardener's daughter. Sargon's life began in obscurity. His mother, fearful and desperate, set him upon the waters, entrusting him to the mercy of the river. Yet fate had a different story in mind. The child did not drift into oblivion. Instead, he was found lifted from the waters by Aki, a gardener of the royal court of Kish. Aki took the boy in, raising him with gentle hands, teaching him the ways of the earth, the scent of the soil, the song of the wind in the reeds. But Sargon was not a child who would be content with the quiet life of a gardener. He was a boy who looked at the walls of Kish and saw not just a city, but a world waiting to be claimed. His eyes, dark and fierce, saw more than the soft leaves of plants. They saw the shimmer of swords, the banners of armies, the glittering crowns of kings. As he grew, Sargon's courage matched his ambition. He served in the court of Kish, rising from a mere gardener's son to a trusted cupbearer, a position of honor, but one that could never satisfy his restless heart. He watched the kings of Kish rule with power and pride, yet he saw their flaws, their greed, their blindness, their belief that the world was theirs by right. Sargon was different. He believed that a man could seize his own destiny, that power was not a gift but a prize to be won. And so he gathered warriors to his side, men who saw in him a spark of greatness. He marched against Kish, his eyes filled with the fire of a dream, his voice a promise to his men that they would not merely survive, but conquer. The walls of Kish fell, and with them the world would come to know the name of Sargon. He was no longer an orphan, no longer a gardener's son. He was Sargon of Akkad, the king of kings, the first emperor, a man who would carve his name into the bones of history, forging an Emperor Sargon's dream, did not end with Kish, with a voice. Like thunder and a gaze that burned like the desert sun, he led his warriors across the land. They marched beneath banners of crimson and gold, their bronze swords flashing in the light. City after city fell before him. Yor, Lagash, Umma, their proud walls crumbled. Their kings knelt at his feet, but Sargon was more than just a conqueror. He was a force of nature, a storm that swept across Mesopotamia. His armies moved like rivers, swift and unstoppable. From the mountains of Elam in the east to the shores of the Mediterranean in the west, his power stretched. Merchants whispered his name in crowded markets. Priests chanted his titles in distant temples. His enemies spoke of him with fear. His allies with awe. Tribute flowed into Akkad gold and silver, grain and spices, fine cloth and precious gems. His capital became a city of wonders, its streets lined with bustling markets, its temples rising toward the heavens. Sargon's empire was a mosaic of peoples and lands, a vast realm where 100 tongues whispered in the shadow of his name. But even in the heart of his greatness, Sargon remained a man who understood the land. He built canals that tamed the wild rivers, brought fresh water to thirsty fields, and turned barren plains into gardens of green. His rule was not just a reign of steel, but of wisdom. He was a king who fed his people, who built cities that shone beneath the desert sun. Yet, the world he built was not a world of peace. His armies marched to maintain order. His generals watched the horizon for threats. Even as his banners flew over distant lands, Sargon knew that the shadow of rebellion was never far away. But he did not fear it. He was Sargon of Akkad, the man who had risen from the river, who had carved an empire from dust. The legacy of Sargon's empire was not just a land of cities and armies. It was a world shaped by words, by laws, by the whisper of knowledge. He did not rule through fear alone. He ruled through wisdom, through the strength of an idea that a king must be more than a warrior. In the grand halls of Akkad, scribes bent over clay tablets, their sharp reeds pressing symbols into damp earth. These were not just marks. They were the voice of an empire. Sargon ordered that his language, Akkadian, would be the voice of his realm. It was a language of kings and merchants, of priests and poets. And through it, his name was whispered in the farthest corners of his domain. He was a builder, a man who raised temples that soared toward the sky, who laid roads that stretched like veins through the heart of his empire. He established laws. Simple, clear, just. His soldiers were not just warriors. They were protectors. His cities were not just fortresses. They were homes, but even as his empire grew, so did the shadows. The people whispered of Sargon's strength, but they also whispered of his pride. His rule was heavy, his demands fierce. Rebellion lurked beneath the quiet streets, and the loyalty of his governors was a thin thread stretched over a dark chasm. Sargon saw this. He knew that even the mightiest of empires could fall. Yet he did not falter. He spoke of unity, of a land where many peoples lived beneath one banner. He ruled with iron and wisdom, a king who stood like a mountain against the winds of time. But mountains can crumble, and even a legend can fade. Sargon's greatness was a light, but it cast a long shadow. The fall of Sargon's name had once been a whisper of awe, a promise of strength. But in the end, it became a shadow. For even the greatest of kings cannot escape the weight of ambition. The cities of his empire, once proud to fly his banner, began to stir with discontent. Governors who had once knelt in loyalty now plotted in secret. The lands he had conquered, with steel now whispered of freedom. The tribute that once flowed into Akkad began to slow. The streets of his capital, once bustling with wealth, grew tense with fear. Sargon, now an old man, saw the empire he had built begin to tremble. His sons rose to rule, but they were not the man he had been. Rebellion swept through the land. City-states raised their banners, and the walls of Akkad, once a symbol of power, became a prison of despair. Yet even as his power faded, Sargon's spirit did not break. He spoke of the days of his youth, of the river that had carried him, of the dream he had forged from dust. He walked the halls of his palace, his voice a quiet echo. And when death finally came, it was not a storm, but a whisper, a quiet. And for a man who had once been a thunder, but death did not silence his name. Sargon of Akkad was gone, but his legend lived on. His empire would crumble, his cities would rise and fall, but his story, the tale of the orphan who became a king, would be whispered beneath the stars. In the dust of Mesopotamia, where rivers still whispered their ancient song, The name of Sargon lived on a reminder that even in a world of shadows, a dream can become a legend. Chapter 5. Naram-Sin, the Divine King, in the shadow of a dying empire, where the echoes of Sargon's greatness still whispered across the desert winds, a new name began to rise: Naram-Sin. He was the grandson of Sargon, but his path too. Power was not a golden road paved with glory. It was a path of chaos, of rebellion and fire. The empire of Akkad, once a beacon of strength, had begun to tremble. Cities that once bowed to Sargon now roared in defiance. The proud lords of Sumer, the priests who whispered to the gods, all saw an opportunity to break free. The land was a patchwork of anger, its fields scorched, its streets filled with whispers of betrayal. But in this darkness, Naram-Sin stood like a blade. He was not a king who ruled by gentle words. He was a warrior, a conqueror. His gaze was fierce, his voice a command. Where others saw chaos, he saw a challenge. With iron in his hand and fire in his heart, he marched against the rebels, his soldiers moving like shadows across the plains. City after city fell before him. Walls crumbled beneath the weight of his siege engines, and rivers ran red beneath the hooves of his cavalry. Those who dared to defy him were shown no mercy. Temples were plundered, towers burned, and the names of rebellious kings were erased from the tablets of history. Naram-Sin did not just conquer, he crushed, yet even in his fury there was a strange, quiet purpose. Naram-Sin was not simply a tyrant. He saw himself as a force of order in a world of chaos. Where the fields had been scorched by war, he ordered them replanted. Where temples lay in ruins, he had them rebuilt, their walls adorned with his name. He was not just a king of war, he was a king of fate, and as the fires of rebellion dimmed, the whispers changed. No longer did they speak of chaos, of Sargon's fading shadow. They spoke of Naram-Sin, a king who rose from the ashes, who wielded the strength of a god, but ambition is a flame that never dies. And for Naram-Sin, the fire had only begun to burn. The empire at its height under Naram-Sin, Akkad, rose to a greatness that even Sargon had never seen. His armies swept across the world, their banners a sea of crimson and gold. From the mountains of Iran to the blue waves of the Mediterranean, his name was whispered with awe. Kings bent their knees. Priests chanted his titles, and merchants brought their treasures to his feet. Tribute flowed like rivers of silver. Gold and lapis lazuli, grain and wine, precious stones and fine cloth, all were laid at the feet of the divine king. His capital, Akkad, glittered beneath the desert sun, its walls towering, its temples rising like mountains toward the heavens. In its streets, merchants bartered beneath the shade of tall palms, their stalls filled with the wealth of 1,000 lands. But Naram-Sin's dream was not just of wealth. It was of power beyond that of any mortal king. He did not simply rule. He declared himself a god, the king of the four corners of the world. He called himself, a title that reached beyond the mountains, beyond the seas, beyond the stars. His image was carved into the stones of his temples, his crown adorned with the horns of divinity, a symbol of his claim to godhood. In the cool, shadowed halls of his palaces, his priests sang hymns to his glory. Scribes pressed his titles into damp clay tablets, their words a promise that his name would live forever. His generals marched beneath his banner, their swords a reminder that to defy Naram's sin was to defy the divine, but in the shadow of his greatness, a quiet darkness stirred. The people of Akkad, who once whispered his name with awe, now spoke of blasphemy. The priests who sang his praises now murmured of pride. For a king to rule was one thing, but to claim the throne of the gods was another. Yet Naram Sin did not hear these whispers. He stood above them, a god-king whose gaze swept across the world. His hands gripped the scepter of empire. His eyes glittered with a light that no mortal king should possess, but even a god cannot silence the winds of. Fate, the curse of Bedtime, is a river, and even the mightiest kings are swept along its current. In the twilight of Naram Sin's reign, the shadows began to gather. The fields of Akkad, once green and bountiful, turned to dust beneath a burning sun. The rivers which had fed his cities shrank beneath a sky that gave no rain. The people whispered of famine, of the anger of the gods, and beneath the whisper of hunger, another whisper grew, the whisper of rebellion. Cities that once bowed to Naram Sin now rose against him. Walls that had sheltered his armies now barred his path. His generals, who had once marched beneath his banner, now rode against him. Akkad, the empire that had stretched to the ends of. The world trembled, but the greatest whisper was the one spoken in the shadowed temples. The priests of the gods, those who had once anointed him with sacred oil, now spoke of a curse. They said that the gods had turned their faces from Akkad, that Naram Sin's pride had brought doom upon the land. They spoke of divine wrath, of a king who had dared to touch the throne of heaven, and Naram Sin listened. The man who had once stood like a god now felt the cold touch of fear. He marched against the rebels, but the land itself seemed to rise against him. Storms lashed his armies, rivers swelled and swept away his men, the fields withered beneath his feet. The cities he had built with fire now burned with a different flame, yet even as the curse whispered, Naram Sin did not fall. He fought, his voice a roar against the darkness, his sword a flash of light in the storm. But the storm did not listen. The land trembled, the people wept, and the empire he had built began to crumble. The fall of the divine king in the end, even gods must fall. Naram Sin, the king who had called himself divine, stood among the ruins of his dream. Akkad, his mighty capital, lay silent beneath the shadow of despair. Its grand temples were empty, their altars cold. The streets that had once thrived with life were quiet, their markets empty, their fountains dry. The rivers that had once carried the wealth of the world now whispered only of loss. The fields once green with grain were barren, the sky above them a pale, merciless blue. The people spoke no more of the divine king. They spoke only of hunger, of death, of the end. Naram Sin, the man who had once ruled as a god, was now just a man. His crown, once a symbol of glory, felt heavy upon his brow. His voice, which had commanded armies, now spoke only to the wind. His eyes, which had blazed with the light of ambition, were shadowed with despair. The priests who had once chanted his name now whispered of his sin. They spoke of the curse of Akkad, of the wrath of the gods. They said that Naram Sin had dared too much, reached too high, and that the heavens themselves had cast him down, and so he died, not in the light of battle, but in the quiet shadow of regret. His name, once a beacon of power, became a whispered tale, a story of pride and punishment, of a man who had dreamed of divinity and found only dust, but even as the wind swept away the dust of Akkad, the name of Naram-Sin did not vanish. It lived on in the whispers of the people, in the stories of the old, in the quiet murmur of the rivers that still flowed through the silent ruins, for in the end, even a fallen king is remembered. Even a broken dream is a dream that was once touched by greatness. Chapter 6, The Dark Age, the Gudian Invasion. There was a time when the great cities of Mesopotamia stood like islands of light in a sea of dust. Their walls rose proud beneath the open sky. Their temples shimmered with the glow of sacred fires, and their streets echoed with the songs of priests and the laughter of children. But that time was gone. Darkness had fallen from the mist-shrouded mountains of the north. The Gudians came fierce, wild warriors with eyes as cold as winter's breath. They were not a people of fields and temples. They did not carve words into clay tablets, nor did they build walls to touch the sky. They were a people of the wild, of mountain passes and shadowed forests. And they came not as settlers, but as conquerors. They swept down upon the plains of Mesopotamia like a storm. Their horses thundered across the fields. Their cries pierced the silent dawn. The cities that had once stood proud now cowered beneath their fury. The ziggurats, which had once been stairways to the heavens, now stood as silent witnesses to the terror below. Temples were plundered, their altars desecrated. Statues of the gods were torn from their sacred halls and cast into the dust. For the Gudians, the ancient gods of summer were nothing but silent idols, powerless against their rage. They did not fear the priests, nor did they honor the kings who once ruled with divine authority. They were a force of chaos, a darkness that swallowed the light of civilization, and so the great cities fell. Uruk, Lagash, Umma, each a jewel in the crown of summer, each now a shadow of its former glory. The fields, once green with grain, were trampled beneath iron hooves. The rivers that had fed the land now whispered only of despair. It was an age without kings, a time when the light of order flickered like a dying flame. The priests whispered prayers to silent gods, their voices thin and desperate. The people trembled beneath the open sky, their eyes turned to the ruins of their homes. Civilization, which had once risen like a song, now seemed a fading dream. But even in the shadow of chaos, something stirred a memory, a whisper of the world that once was, the fall of Akkad in the heart of the darkness. Where the empire of Akkad had once shone like a beacon, there was only silence. Akkad, the shining city of Sargon, was no more. Its walls, which had once stood tall against the desert winds, now lay in ruins. Its grand temples, once filled with the scent of incense and the light of sacred fires, were now broken stones, their altars cold and empty. The streets, which had once thrived with merchants and priests, lay quiet beneath the dust. The markets were empty, the courtyards silent. The laughter of children, the chants of the priests, the whispers of the merchants, all were gone. Only the wind remained, a mournful voice that swept through the empty halls, stirring the dust of forgotten dreams. But Akkad was more than just a city. It was the heart of an empire, a dream that had stretched from the mountains of Elam to the shores of the Mediterranean. It was the dream of Sargon, a dream of unity, of a world brought together beneath one banner. But dreams are fragile things, and even the greatest of empires can crumble. The Gudians did not simply conquer Akkad, they shattered it. They plundered its temples, they cast down its statues. The name of Sargon, which had once been spoken with awe, was now a whisper of a forgotten age. His sons and grandsons, who had once ruled with the strength of their bloodline, were now scattered, their power broken, but even in the darkness, a quiet light flickered. For while Akkad lay in ruins, the spirit of summer was not yet dead. In the silent cities beneath the broken ziggurats, the memory of a golden age lived on. The people whispered of the days when kings ruled with wisdom, when the gods walked among men, when the rivers flowed with life, and though the empire of Akkad was gone, its story was not yet over. The struggle for survival in the shadow of the ruined cities, the people of summer clung to life. They were no longer the proud citizens of great kingdoms, but survivors, farmers who tilled dry fields, priests who whispered desperate prayers to silent gods, merchants who traded not in silver and gold, but in grain and salt. Famine swept across the land. The rivers which had once fed the fields now ran low beneath the scorching sun. The soil, once dark and fertile, turned to dust beneath the withering heat. Crops withered in the fields, and the people went hungry. The cities, which had once been beacons of civilization, became islands of despair, yet even in the darkness, there was a quiet strength. In the shadow of the ruined temples, the priests still whispered their prayers. Beneath the broken ziggurats, the people gathered, sharing what little they had. Kings became warlords, ruling not with divine right, but with the strength of their swords. City walls became fortresses, not of faith, but of fear. But even as the world crumbled, hope remained. In the quiet darkness, mothers whispered ancient stories to their children, stories of Sargon, of Gilgamesh, of a world where the gods walked among men. In the silence of the temples, the priests spoke of the promise of the gods, of a time when the light would return, for even in the darkest of nights, the stars still shine, a new dawn. The city of darkness cannot endure forever. Beneath the shadow of despair, in the city of Yor, a new light began to flicker. Yor, a city that had once stood in the shadow of Akkad, now rose as a beacon of hope. Its walls were repaired, its temples were cleansed, and its fields were sown once more with grain. Here, beneath the watchful gaze of the moon god Nana, a new dynasty stirred. Kings who remembered the glory of summer, who dreamed of a world brought back from the ashes. They were not conquerors, but rebuilders. They spoke of peace, of order, of a world where the gods were honored and the fields were green. Beneath the towering ziggurat of Yor, priests sang hymns to the heavens, their voices a quiet promise that the gods had not turned their backs on summer. Merchants returned to the markets, their stalls filled once more with dates and spices, silver and lapis lazuli. Farmers plowed the fields, their hands stained with the dark earth, their faces warmed by the gentle sun. The kings of Yor did not speak of empire. They spoke of peace. They built walls, not to conquer, but to protect. They rebuilt temples, not to display power, but to honor the gods. They were kings who remembered the lessons of the past, that greatness is not found in pride, but in wisdom, in kindness, in the quiet strength of a people who refuse to be broken. And so, beneath the shadow of the ziggurat, the flame of civilization burned once more. The darkness that had swallowed Mesopotamia began to fade, and the light of summer, which had flickered like a dying candle, now shone once more with a gentle, steady glow. For even in a world of shadows, there is always a place for light. Even in a land without kings, there is always the promise of a new dawn. Chapter 7. The Third Dynasty of Yor, a Sumerian Renaissance out of the ashes of chaos. In the silent ruins of a broken land, there rose a man whose name would become a beacon of hope, Ur-Nammu. He was not a conqueror who claimed his throne with blood, but a builder who restored it with wisdom. In a world scarred by darkness, he spoke of light. Where other kings had ruled with iron, he ruled with justice. Ur-Nammu came to power in the city of Yor, a city that had once flickered like a dying candle, but now stood as a beacon in the shadow of despair. He declared himself the savior of summer, a king who did not merely speak of greatness, but worked to rebuild it. His first decree was one of peace, a promise to the people that the wars of the past would end, that the fields would be sown, the temples restored, and the rivers would flow with life once more. He did not simply speak of justice. He wrote it. The Code of Ur-Nammu, a great law code inscribed in the soft clay of the tablets, was a promise to his people, a promise that their lives would not be ruled by fear, but by fairness. His laws spoke of rights, of protection for the weak, of punishments that were measured, not cruel. This was a world where even the poorest could find shelter beneath the shadow of the king's justice. But Ur-Nammu's vision was not just of law. It was of life. He ordered the temples rebuilt, their walls rising once more toward the sky. Priests returned to their sacred halls, their prayers filling the air with quiet hope. The people of summer, who had once trembled beneath the swords of the Gutians, now walked with pride beneath the watchful eyes of their gods. In the fields, farmers worked the soil, their hands stained with the rich earth, their faces warmed by the gentle sun. Merchants returned to the markets, their voices a lively chorus, their stalls filled with grain, silver, and spices. Craftsmen shaped clay and stone, their fingers carving beauty from dust. Ur-Nammu was not a king who merely wore a crown. He was a king who built a world. His city, Yor, became a symbol of rebirth, a place where the dream of summer lived again. But his greatest work was yet to rise, a monument that would touch the sky itself, the great ziggurat of Ur high above the plains of summer, beneath the endless blue sky. There rose a mountain of man's making, the great ziggurat of Yor. It was more than just a temple. It was a symbol of faith, of strength, of a people who had risen from the shadows to touch the heavens once more. Layer upon layer, brick upon brick, the ziggurat soared toward the sky. Its terraces stretched wide, their sun-baked bricks glowing like gold beneath the light. Stairways rose in steep, sacred steps, winding upward toward the silent heavens. At the very top, a shrine stood, a place where earth touched the sky, where the gods could hear the prayers of men. The priests of Yor climbed those steps, their robes flowing like shadows in the breeze. They carried offerings, sweet dates, fine oils, silver, and lapis lazuli, gifts for the moon god Nana, the guardian of the night, whose light touched the fields with silver. Beneath the soft glow of the moon, their hymns rose, quiet whispers carried on the wind. But the ziggurat was not just a place for priests. It was a place for all. Beneath its shadow, the city of Yor prospered. Farmers looked up from their fields, their eyes resting on the towering temple, a reminder that they were not alone. Merchants sold their goods in the bustling markets. There, stalls filled with silver and spices, their faces touched by the light of faith for the people of Yor. The ziggurat was not just a monument, it was a promise that the gods had not turned their backs, that the darkness of the past had not won. It was a place where prayers rose like mist, where the quiet hope of a broken land found a voice, and even as the wind whispered across the plains. Carrying the scent of fresh earth and the soft hum of distant chants, the great ziggurat stood a silent guardian, a symbol of a dream reborn, the glory of Urwith, the rise of the ziggurat. The city of yore became more than just a city. It became a jewel of summer, a place where life flowed like the rivers that fed its fields. Trade returned. Ships from distant lands docked at its bustling ports, their sails bright beneath the warm sun. From Dilmun came sweet dates and fragrant spices. From Megan came copper, bright and strong. From Maluha came the shimmering blue of lapis lazuli, the golden glow of fine jewels. The markets of yore were a sea of color, a place where merchants spoke in 100 tongues, where silver coins flashed beneath the shade of palm leaves. The city was alive with art and song. Sculptors carved the faces of kings and gods from smooth, cool stone. Jewelers shaped gold into delicate bracelets, silver into fine rings. Potters spun their wheels, their fingers shaping wet clay into graceful vases. In quiet halls, poets sang of heroes and gods, their voices a gentle music beneath the stars, but beneath the splendor, cracks began to appear. For even in a city of wealth, there were whispers of envy, of pride. Kings who once spoke of peace, now spoke of power. Priests who once sang of faith, now whispered of influence. And beyond the walls of yore, in the shadowed mountains to the east, a new threat began to stir. Yet for the people of yore, life continued. The fields turned green beneath the soft touch of spring. The rivers whispered of distant lands. The ziggurat rose, a silent guardian beneath the sky. And in the quiet streets, beneath the soft glow of lanterns, the city of your dreamed on, the fall of Ur, but all dreams must end. The mountains to the east, which had always seemed distant and quiet, now became a place of shadows. The Elamites, fierce warriors from the highlands, marched upon the plains of summer. Their armor shone beneath the sun, their swords flashed like lightning. Yore, the city of splendor, the city of faith, now stood beneath the shadow of war. Its walls, which had once been a shelter, now became a prison. The fields which had once fed the people were trampled beneath iron hooves. The rivers which had once whispered of life now carried only fear. The temples of yore, which had once echoed with hymns, now stood silent. The priests who had once climbed the sacred stairs of the ziggurat now trembled in the shadows. The great shrine of Nana, which had once shone beneath the silver light of the moon, now stood dark and empty. The Elamites swept through the streets, their cries filling the air like thunder. The markets burned, the fields turned to ash. The statues of the gods were cast down, their faces shattered upon the stones. The great ziggurat, which had once touched the sky, now cast a shadow of despair. Yore fell, its temples shattered, its people scattered. The dream of summer, which had risen like the dawn, now faded like the dying light of evening. The city that had once been a beacon of hope was now a ruin beneath the silent sky, but even in the darkness, something remained. The name of your lived on, a whisper of a golden age, a memory of a time when kings were wise and the gods watched over the land. For though the city had fallen, the dream of summer was not yet dead, and beneath the quiet stars, the rivers of Mesopotamia still whispered their ancient song. Chapter 8. the rise of Babylon Hammurabi's code from the fading shadows of summer, from the ashes of yore, and the silence of Akkad, there rose a city that would become a beacon of power and faith Babylon. Nestled by the slow, whispering waters of the Euphrates, Babylon was more than just a city of brick and stone. It was a city of dreams, a place where the gods were not just distant figures but living presences. And above all the gods of Babylon stood one Marduk, the Lord. Of the heavens, Babylon's walls were strong, thick ramparts of sun-baked clay that stretched high against the open sky. Its gates, adorned with carved images of lions and dragons, stood as silent guardians, watching over the bustling streets. Merchants from distant lands crowded the marketplaces, their stalls filled with silver, spices, and bright fabrics. Farmers brought their harvests, priests whispered prayers, and children laughed beneath the shade of palm trees. But Babylon was not just a city of wealth. It was a city of faith. In the heart of the city stood the great temple of Marduk, its golden statue, towering over the courtyard. Priests in white robes climbed its sacred steps, their voices rising in hymns to the sky. Smoke from incense curled toward the heavens, a bridge between the world of men and the world of the gods, and from this city, blessed by the gods, there rose a man who would carve his name into the stones of history. His name was Hammurabi. He was not the first king of Babylon, but he was the greatest. Tall and strong, with a gaze like iron, he was a man who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. He was not content with the quiet peace of a single city. He dreamed of an empire where his name would be whispered in awe. Hammurabi was not just a king. He was a dreamer, a builder, a conqueror. And in the streets of Babylon, beneath the watchful eyes of Marduk, his dream began to take shape. The code of Hammurabi's greatness was not built with swords alone. He was a man who believed that a true king did not simply rule. He gave order to the world. And so, in the shadow of Marduk's great temple, he created a monument not of stone, but of words. The code of Hammurabi was a great black steel, a towering pillar of smooth, dark stone. At its top, a carving showed Hammurabi standing before the god Shamash, the god of justice, his hand raised in respect. Beneath this image, in neat, sharp lines, were the laws, nearly 300 of them, written in clear, precise words. They were not the commands of a tyrant, but the promise of a king, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, the laws declared. It was a simple idea, but a powerful one, that justice was not the will of the strong, but the word of the king. The code spoke of many things. It spoke of merchants, of farmers, of priests. It spoke of marriage and inheritance, of trade and labor. It protected the weak. It punished the wicked. It demanded fairness for the people of Babylon. These laws were not just words. They were a promise that they would not be crushed beneath the heel of the powerful, that they would be judged not by the whims of men, but by the wisdom of a king. Even the priests who spoke with the voice of the gods were bound by these laws. Even the mighty were not beyond the reach of justice. Hammurabi's code was not just a list of rules. It was a vision of a world where law stood above strength, where even the poorest could find shelter beneath the shadow of justice. And as the sun rose above the great steel, casting its light upon the sharp, clear words, the people of Babylon knew that they were more than just subjects. They were citizens of a kingdom of law, The Babylonian Empire, but Hammurabi was not only a lawgiver. He was a king who saw beyond the walls of Babylon, who dreamed of a world united beneath his banner. With a voice that commanded like thunder and a gaze that burned like the desert sun, he led his armies across the land. Beneath his banner, the soldiers of Babylon marched, their spears gleaming, their chariots thundering over the dry earth. To the east lay the mountains of Elam, their kings fierce and proud. But against the strength of Babylon they fell. To the west stretched the deserts of Canaan, their cities rich but divided. One by one they bowed to the will of Hammurabi. Cities that had once whispered of independence now spoke his name with. Babylon was no longer just a city, it was an empire. Tribute flowed like rivers of silver. Merchants brought their treasures, bright silks, sparkling gems, sweet spices to the gates of the great city. Farmers plowed fields that stretched to the horizon, their grain feeding 1,000 souls. Priests in distant temples chanted prayers in the name of Hammurabi, the king who brought order to a world of chaos. Yet even in his greatness, Hammurabi was not a king who ruled with cruelty. His armies conquered, but they did not destroy. His soldiers marched, but they did not plunder. For Hammurabi was not just a conqueror, he was a builder. He repaired the temples of the cities he claimed. He restored their walls. He brought peace where there had been only war, and beneath the warm light of the sun, the rivers of Mesopotamia whispered his name. Hammurabi, the king of Babylon. The ruler of an empire, the giver of law, the legacy of Hammurabi, even the greatest of kings, must one day leave the world. Hammurabi's empire, which had stretched across the deserts and mountains, began to tremble. After his death, the lands he had conquered grew restless. Kings who had once bowed to his will now rose in defiance. Cities that had whispered his name with a now spoke of freedom. The great walls of Babylon, which had once stood as a symbol of power, now seemed to cast a shadow of doubt. The rivers which had once carried silver and grain now whispered of rebellion. Hammurabi's sons tried to hold his empire together, but they were not the man he had been. One by one, the distant lands slipped away, but even as his empire crumbled, Hammurabi's dream did not die. For his code, the great steel of black stone, its words clear and strong remained. Kings would come and go, empires would rise and fall, but the laws of Hammurabi would endure. They would be studied by priests, whispered by merchants, remembered by the people, for in the shadow of his code there was more than just words. There was a promise that justice was more than the whim of kings, that fairness was more than a dream. It was a law written in stone, a voice that spoke even when the world fell silent, and as the centuries passed, as the dust of time settled upon the streets of Babylon, the name of Hammurabi remained, not just as a king, not just as a conqueror, but as a lawgiver, a man who believed that even in a world of chaos, there could be order beneath the quiet stars. The Euphrates whispered its ancient song, and in the silent temples of Babylon, the words of Hammurabi stood a dream of justice carved in stone. Chapter 9. The Assyrian kings, lords of war, in the northern plains of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris River cut through the dry earth like a silver thread, there rose a city of stone and strength Asher. This was not a city of poets or priests alone. It was a fortress, a place where the air carried the scent of iron and the shadow of ambition. Asher was not just a city. It was a cradle of power The city took its name from the god Ashur, the war god whose fierce eyes watched over his people. In the shadowed halls of his great temple, priests whispered his name, their voices a quiet prayer beneath the glow of sacred flames. Smoke curled toward the heavens, a bridge between the world of men and the world of the divine. And in the quiet light of dawn, warriors bowed before his altar, their swords laid at his feet, their hearts filled with the promise of conquest. Ashur was a city of walls thick, towering walls that rose against the open sky. Its streets were narrow, its markets bustling with the clatter of iron and the scent of spices. But beneath the hum of life, there was always the quiet murmur of war. This was a city where even the farmers spoke of battle, where the children played with wooden swords, and the air itself seemed to tremble with the promise of glory. From this city came kings, men who did not see the world as a place of peace, but as a prize to be won. They were not content to rule a single city. They were not content to watch the fields turn green beneath the spring rain. They were dreamers, but their dreams were made of iron and blood. And so, from Ashur, the kings of Assyria marched fierce, relentless, their spears gleaming like stars beneath the sun. Their banners rose against the blue sky, their chariots thundered across the plains, and the world trembled beneath their shadow. For these were not kings who ruled by the grace of the gods. They were kings who ruled by the strength of their swords. In the city of Ashur, the priests whispered of faith, but the kings spoke of power. And beneath the watchful gaze of the war god, the dream of empire stirred. The conquerors of Mesopotamia, the Syrian kings, were not content to dream. They were men who carved their names into the bones of history with swords and fire. They were more than rulers. They were conquerors. Tiglath-Pileser, the first of the great warlords, marched from the gates of Ashur with a voice like thunder. His armies swept across the lands of Mesopotamia, their iron swords flashing beneath the burning sun. City after city fell before him, their walls crumbling, their kings bowing in fear. He was a king who did not ask for loyalty, he demanded it. Ashurnasirpal followed, a king whose name became a whisper of terror. His warriors were a storm of iron. Their chariots thundered across the plains, their bows whispered death. Where they marched, cities burned. The rivers ran red, and the cries of the defeated rose like a dark hymn to the heavens. For Ashurnasirpal did not conquer to rule, he conquered to crush. But even his fury was only a shadow before the might of Sargon too. Sargon was not just a king. He was a force of nature, a man who saw the world as a battlefield. His armies marched to the ends of the earth, their banners bright against the desert sky. From the mountains of Elam to the shores of the Mediterranean, his name was a shadow that stretched across the land. He built fortresses, he cast down kings, and he spoke of an empire that would never die. For the Assyrian kings, war was not a burden. It was a promise that their names would live on, that their enemies would whisper their titles in fear. And beneath the iron hooves of their chariots, the world trembled, yet even in their greatness there was a shadow. For the kings of Assyria were not builders. They were not men who spoke of peace. They were men who saw the world as a prize to be taken, a dream to be seized. And in their wake they left only dust and despair, the glory of Nineveh. But even conquerors must have a place of rest. For the Assyrian kings, that place was Nineveh. Set along the banks of the Tigris, Nineveh was more than just a city. It was a world of wonders, a place where the dreams of kings became stone and gold. The palaces of Nineveh rose like mountains against the sky, their walls adorned with carvings of kings and gods. Great winged bulls stood as silent guardians at their gates, their fierce eyes watching all who entered. Inside, vast halls stretched beneath ceilings of painted stars. Floors of polished stone shone beneath the soft light of hanging lamps, and the air was filled with the scent of incense and the quiet hum of whispered prayers. But Nineveh was not just a place of power. It was a place of beauty. Its gardens bloomed. Above the city walls, bright flowers spilling over the terraces, their colors a soft touch of life against the cold stone. Fountains whispered beneath the shade of tall palms, their waters cool and clear. Birds sang in the trees, their songs a gentle music beneath the open sky, and in the heart of Nineveh stood its greatest treasure, the great library. Shelves, stretched high, filled with clay tablets, their sharp, clear marks of voice from the past. Scribes worked in quiet halls, pressing reeds into damp clay, preserving the wisdom of 1,000 years. Here, the kings of Assyria did not just dream of conquest. They dreamed of knowledge. Nineveh was a city of warlords, but it was also a city of wonder. A place where the strength of iron walked beside the grace of beauty, where the cries of conquest rose alongside the quiet whispers of ancient wisdom. But even the greatest of cities is but a shadow beneath the stars. The fall of Assyria, for even iron can shatter. The kings of Assyria, who had once spoken of an empire that would never die, now found their dream crumbling beneath their feet. The world they had conquered, the cities they had burned, now rose against them. From the south came Babylon, a city that remembered the weight of Assyrian chains. Its kings spoke of freedom. Its warriors marched with the strength of rage. The rivers whispered of rebellion. The fields turned red beneath the clash of steel, but the true blow came from the mountains. The Medes, fierce warriors from the highlands, swept down like a storm. Their spears flashed in the sunlight, their voices a roar beneath the open sky. The cities of Assyria, which had once stood like mountains, now trembled. Nineveh, the jewel of the empire, the city of wonders, became a city of flames. Its palaces burned, their golden halls choked with smoke. The gardens which had once bloomed with life now withered beneath the heat. The great library, with its shelves of wisdom, was buried beneath ash and ruin. The warlords who had once spoken of glory now spoke of fear. The iron walls of Nineveh, which had once stood as a fortress, now crumbled beneath the fury of the storm. The kings of Assyria, who had once ruled with fire and iron, were now shadows beneath the falling sky, and so the empire of the warlords ended. The world they had carved with swords became dust. The names of their kings, once whispered in fear, now faded like the smoke of their burning cities. But even in the ashes, something remained. The stories of their conquests, the whispers of their power, the ruins of their cities, these were shadows that would not fade. Beneath the quiet stars, the Tigris still whispered its ancient song, and the ruins of Nineveh stood silent. Reminder that even the mightiest of kings must one day fall. Chapter 10. The Rise of Neo-Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's glory. From the silent dust of forgotten empires, from the ruins of shattered walls and broken dreams, there rose a city like no other Babylon. It was not just a city of brick and stone. It was a place of wonder, a jewel set in the heart of Mesopotamia, Where the slow silver waters of the Euphrates whispered beneath the warm sun, Babylon had been reborn under the hand of a king whose name would echo across the ages, Nebuchadnezzar II. He was not just a ruler. He was a dreamer, a builder, a man whose vision reached beyond the horizon. Beneath his rule, Babylon became a city of marvels, a place where the sky itself seemed to touch the earth. The walls of Babylon were a wonder of the world. They stretched high and wide, thick as a forest of stone, their tops lost in the morning mist. Soldiers marched along their ramparts, their armor gleaming beneath the sunlight. Towers rose like silent guardians, their shadows stretching across the golden fields. No enemy could breach these walls, or so the people believed, but the true heart of Babylon lay beyond the walls, in the city's bustling streets and sacred temples. Merchants from distant lands filled the markets, their stalls brimming with silver, spices, and silk. Priests sang hymns in the shadowed halls, their voices rising in soft, sacred whispers. And above it all, there rose a wonder whispered of in distant lands, the hanging gardens. The gardens were a dream given life. Terraces of green rose one above the other, their stone walls hidden beneath a cascade of flowers and vines. Water flowed from hidden springs, falling in gentle streams, feeding the lush plants. Flowers of every color danced in the breeze, their petals bright against the blue sky. Here, beneath the cool shade, birds sang, and the air was sweet with the scent of blossoms. It was said that Nebuchadnezzar built these gardens for his queen, a woman who longed for the green mountains of her homeland. But in truth, they were more than a gift. They were a symbol of promise that even in the heart of the desert, life could bloom. That even beneath the shadow of great walls, there could be beauty. Babylon was not just a city. It was a dream, a place where the world gathered beneath the light of a golden sun. Conquests and glory, but Nebuchadnezzar was not just a builder. He was a king, a warrior whose gaze stretched beyond the walls of Babylon. To him, the world was not a place of peace. It was a prize to be won. And so, beneath the shadow of his banners, his armies marched from the deserts of Arabia, where the wind whispered across the endless sands, to the mountains of Judah, where the temples rose beneath the open sky. The armies of Babylon swept like a storm. Spears flashed in the sunlight, chariots thundered across the plains, and the world trembled beneath their iron hooves. Jerusalem, a city of faith and stone, stood proud against the coming storm. Its priests spoke of a God who watched over his people. Its kings whispered of strength. But against the might of Babylon, their walls were but shadows. The city fell, its temples burned beneath the light of the rising sun. The sacred treasures were taken, the people carried away in chains, a people who would sing of this loss in the quiet of distant lands. But Nebuchadnezzar's dream did not end in Jerusalem. His armies marched farther, their banners bright against the sky. Cities bowed before him, their rulers laid their crowns at his feet. From the rivers of the Euphrates to the banks of the Nile, his name was whispered in awe. He was not just a king. He was a conqueror, a man who saw the world not as a place of peace, but as a place of glory. Yet even in his greatness, Nebuchadnezzar was not cruel. Cities that bowed before him were not burned. Their people were not slaughtered. Instead, they were woven into the tapestry of his empire, their gods honored, their temples spared. He did not simply conquer, he united, and so the rivers of Mesopotamia whispered his name, and beneath the bright light of the sun, the empire of Babylon stretched like a shadow across the land. The Ishtar Gate, a symbol of power above the bustling streets of Babylon, beneath the warm light of the sun, there rose a gateway like no other, the Ishtar Gate. It was not just an entrance. It was a promise, a symbol of the city's power and pride. The gate soared high, its bricks a deep, shimmering blue, like the waters of a calm sea. Dragons and lions walked its walls, bright golden beasts, whose fierce eyes seemed to watch all who passed beneath them. They were more than just decoration. They were guardians, a reminder that this was the city of Marduk, the city of kings. Through this gate, the world passed. Merchants from distant lands, their camels heavy with spices and silver. Soldiers who marched beneath bright banners, their swords gleaming in the sunlight. Priests who carried sacred relics, their robes flowing like shadows. The Ishtar Gate was the threshold of an empire, a place where the dreams of Babylon touched the earth. But it was more than just a gateway. It was a message too. The world that this was Babylon, a city of strength, a city of beauty, a city where even the walls spoke of wonder. Beneath the light of dawn, the blue bricks shimmered like a quiet sea. Beneath the soft glow of dusk, they seemed to whisper of ancient stories, and as the stars rose above the silent city, the Ishtar Gate stood, a silent guardian, a promise that Babylon was more than just a city. It was a world, the fall of Babylon, but even the greatest of cities must one day fall. Beneath the shadow of its mighty walls, beneath the light of its golden temples, there was a quiet whisper of change. Far to the east, beyond the mountains, a new power stirred Persia. Cyrus, king of Persia, marched with an army like the sea. His banners rose like the dawn. His voice was a promise of peace. City after city bowed before him. Their gates swung wide without a fight. For Cyrus was not just a conqueror. He was a liberator, a man who spoke not of chains but of freedom. Babylon, the city of wonder, the jewel of Mesopotamia, stood proud against the coming storm. Its walls were strong, its soldiers brave. But within those walls there were whispers of doubt. The priests spoke of omens, the merchants whispered of change. And as the armies of Persia swept closer, the gates of Babylon did not stand firm. They opened. Cyrus entered Babylon not as a conqueror, but as a king. The temples were not burned. The people were not slaughtered. The great ziggurat still rose. Beneath the silent sky, the hanging gardens still bloomed above the city streets. Babylon had fallen, but it had not been destroyed, but the dream of Nebuchadnezzar was gone. The city that had been the jewel of the world was now just another province of a greater empire. The hanging gardens, which had once been a wonder, were now a quiet memory. The Ishtar Gate, which had once been a symbol of power, now stood as a shadow of a forgotten age, yet even as the light of Babylon faded, its name lived on. The stories of its wonders, the memory of its kings, the whisper of its streets, these would never be forgotten. For even as the world changed, even as the rivers whispered of new empires and new kings, the name of Babylon would remain, and beneath the quiet stars, the Euphrates still flowed, a silver thread through the silent plains, a whisper of a city that had once touched the sky. Chapter 11. The Persian conquest Cyrus the Great, in the quiet valleys and rugged mountains of Persia, where the cool winds whispered through the high passes, a child was born, a child whose name would one day echo across the world. His name was Cyrus, a prince of Anshan, a land of stone and shadow. But he was more than just a prince. He was a dreamer, a warrior, a man whose fate was written in the silent stars above, Cyrus was born to a world divided, a world of rival kingdoms and endless wars. The lands of Persia were a patchwork of tribes, each proud, each fierce, each willing to spill blood for a patch of dry earth. But even as a child, Cyrus saw beyond the mountains, beyond the scattered villages. He saw a world where the scattered could be united, where the many could become one. As he grew, his strength became legend. His voice was calm, but his words were a promise. Warriors who had once been rivals became his brothers. Tribes who had once fought over barren hills now marched beneath his banner. And Cyrus was not just a king of swords. He was a king of wisdom. He spoke not just of conquest, but of justice. With iron in his hands and a dream in his heart, Cyrus led his warriors across the mountains, their spears glittering in the sunlight, their banners bright against the blue sky. City after city fell before him, not just because of his strength, but because of his promise. He spoke not of chains, but of freedom. He was a conqueror, but he was also a liberator. His name became a whisper on the wind, a promise of hope, a harbinger of empire. The lands of Media, fierce and proud, bowed before him. Lydia, a kingdom of gold, fell to his strength. And yet, his dream was not of plunder, but of unity. He did not simply conquer, he embraced, and so, from the distant mountains of Persia, there rose a man whose shadow stretched across the world. A man whose sword brought victory, but whose words brought peace. Cyrus the Great, the fall of Babylon far to the west, where the slow silver waters of the Euphrates whispered beneath the sun, there stood a city of wonder, Babylon. Its walls stretched high against the sky, thick and proud, their tops lost in the morning mist. Its gates were adorned with golden lions. Its temples rose like mountains of stone. In its streets, merchants whispered of distant lands, priests sang hymns to Marduk, and kings spoke of power, but even the greatest of cities can be blind to the winds of change. Beneath the shadow of its towers, whispers stirred. The priests, who once sang of faith, now murmured of discontent. The merchants who once spoke of wealth, now whispered of fear. The city was a jewel, but its light was fading, and beyond the horizon, beneath the warm light of the desert sun, there marched an army. Banners bright against the sky, spears like a sea of silver, and at their head rode a man whose name was a promise. Cyrus. The armies of Persia swept across the plains like a quiet storm. They did not burn the fields. They did not plunder the villages. Instead, they spoke of freedom. They spoke of a world where faith was a choice, where kings were not tyrants, but protectors. And the people listened. Babylon's walls, which had once seemed eternal, now trembled beneath the weight of whispers. The gates, which had once stood firm against the world, now swung open without a fight. And Cyrus entered, not as a conqueror, but as a king. The temples were spared, the streets were silent, the people watched in awe. Cyrus stood before the great temple of Marduk, the sacred place of Babylon's god. He did not cast down the statues. He did not silence the priests. Instead, he spoke of peace. He proclaimed that all faiths would be honored, that all peoples would be free. The city of Babylon had fallen, but it had not been destroyed. In the quiet shadow of its great walls, beneath the light of a gentle sun, the golden city bowed before the king of Persia. And in that quiet there was a promise that Babylon's dream would live on, not in chains, but in peace, a new order the Persian Emperor was not just a conqueror. He was a builder, a man who did not simply dream of power, but of a world where many could become one. In the shadow of Babylon's great ziggurat, he proclaimed a new vision, a vision of tolerance, of justice, of a world where all could live. Beneath the shadow of peace, the Persian Empire was not just an empire of swords. It was an empire of faiths. In the temples of Babylon, the priests still sang their hymns. In the hills of Judah, the exiled people spoke of a king who had set them free. In the mountains of Persia, the ancient fires still burned, their light. A quiet whisper of faith, Cyrus spoke not just of rule, but of protection. His subjects were not slaves, they were citizens. They were free to worship their own gods, to speak their own tongues, to live in peace beneath the protection of the king. He did not destroy the kingdoms he conquered. He embraced them. In the bustling markets of Susa, merchants spoke 100 tongues. In the quiet halls of Ecbatana, priests whispered 1,000 prayers. The roads of Persia stretched like silver threads across the land, connecting mountains and deserts, rivers and seas. Messengers rode beneath the light of the stars, there. Voices carrying the king's word from one end of the empire to the other. This was not just an empire of iron. It was an empire of peace. A place where the weak were protected, where the strong were just, where even the poorest could find shelter beneath the shadow of the king's justice. And at the heart of this empire stood a man whose dream had become a world, Cyrus the Great, the legacy of Cyrus. But even the greatest of kings must one day fall. In the distant lands of the east, where the mountains rose like shadows against the sky, Cyrus met his end. His warriors whispered of battle, of fierce tribes who did not bow, of a fierce struggle beneath the open sky. The man who had brought peace to the world met death beneath the cold wind of a foreign land. Yet even as his body fell, his dream did not die. For Cyrus had built more than just an empire. He had built a world where many could live as one, a world where the strong protected the weak, a world where faith was a choice and justice was a promise. His tomb, a simple stone structure in the quiet plains of Pasargadae, whispered of a king who had conquered the world, but sought only peace. Beneath its silent shadow, flowers bloomed, and the wind whispered through the tall grass. It was not a grand palace. It was a place of quiet rest, but his name did not rest. It lived on in the whispers of the priests, in the songs of the poets, in the quiet prayers of the free. The Persian Empire would rise and fall, kings would come and go, but the dream of Cyrus would live on, a dream of a world united not by chains, but by peace, and beneath the quiet stars, where the rivers of Persia whispered their ancient song, the name of Cyrus the Great would remain a gentle light in the shadow of history. Chapter 12. The Rise of Darius the Golden Empire. In the shadow of Cyrus the Great, the Persian Empire stood vast and mighty, a world of mountains and deserts, rivers and seas. But even the greatest of empires can tremble. And so it was, in the wake of Cyrus, that the land of Persia knew chaos. Kings rose and kings fell. Names whispered in the grand halls of Susa became forgotten echoes in the dust. The golden dream of unity flickered like a candle caught in the wind. Rebellions flared in distant lands. Governors spoke not of loyalty, but of ambition. The throne of Persia seemed a prize for any who could seize it, but even in the heart of chaos, there can rise a man who sees more than darkness. His name was Darius. He was not born to the throne, but he was born to greatness. A warrior by blood, a statesman by fate. Where others saw chaos, he saw a challenge. Where others whispered of power, he spoke of order Darius did not claim the throne with. Quiet words. He seized it with strength, with the edge of his sword, with the loyalty of his men. The traitors who had whispered of crowns now whispered of fear. Those who had marched against the empire now marched beneath his banner. One by one, the flames of rebellion were extinguished, and the whisper of chaos gave way to the quiet hum of peace. But Darius was more than a conqueror. He was a builder. He spoke of law, of justice, of a world where even the mightiest would bow before the light of truth. His voice was a promise, and his sword was a reminder. The scattered lands of Persia did not simply kneel before him. They were bound together by his will beneath the light of the sun, in the shadow of the mountains. A new dream rose, the dream of a golden empire. An empire where many lands could live as one, where kings ruled not by fear, but by wisdom, and at the heart of this empire stood Darius, the king who had brought order where there had been only chaos, the royal road in trade. But Darius was not content with mere conquest. He was a man who saw beyond the walls of his cities, beyond the mountains of his homeland. To him, an empire was not just a place of warriors and kings. It was a world of people, of merchants and farmers, of poets and priests. It was a world that needed to be connected, and so he built not just palaces, but roads. The greatest of these was the royal road, a path that stretched like a silver thread across the vast empire, from the city of Susa beneath the warm sun. Of Persia to Sardis in the distant west, the royal road was a lifeline, a path that brought the world together beneath the open sky. Merchants traveled this road, their caravans heavy with treasures, silver and spices, fine cloth and bright jewels. They whispered of distant lands, of great cities, of temples where strange gods were worshipped. At each station along the road, fresh horses waited, and messengers flew like the wind, their words a promise that even the farthest corners of the empire were never truly far. But the royal road was more than just a path of trade. It was a path of knowledge. Priests traveled beneath the shadow of the mountains, sharing their faith. Scholars carried tablets filled with ancient wisdom. And through it all, Darius watched a king who did not simply speak of power, but who wove his empire together like a tapestry of 1,000 threads along the banks of the rivers. Farmers plowed the fields, their hands stained with the rich earth. In the quiet markets of distant cities, merchants bartered beneath the warm light of day. And in the cool halls of Susa, the voice of the king carried like a quiet wind, a promise of peace, of law, of a world bound together not by chains, but by trust. For Darius, a road was not just a path. It was a promise, the grand palaces of Persepolis. But even a king who walks the open roads must have a place of rest. For Darius, that place was Persepolis, a city of stone and light, a place where dreams became marble, where the mountains seemed to kneel before the throne of the king. Persepolis rose upon the plains of Persia, beneath the quiet shadow of the mountains. Its walls were bright with the warm glow of the sun. Its grand halls stretched beneath ceilings painted with stars. Golden pillars rose like silent guardians, their tops shaped like the heads of bulls, watching over the throne of the king. Darius did not build Persepolis as a fortress. He built it as a symbol, a place where kings could gather, where envoys from distant lands could speak of peace. Its halls were filled with light. Its floors were cool marble beneath the feet of princes and priests. Here the air was sweet with the scent of incense, and the quiet hum of whispered prayers rose like a soft breeze. But Persepolis was more than just a palace. It was a city of beauty. Its gardens bloomed beneath the warm sun, bright flowers spilling over stone terraces. Fountains whispered beneath the shade of tall trees, their waters clear and cool. Birds sang in the branches, their songs a gentle music beneath the open sky. Here Darius walked, a king who did not simply speak of power, but of peace. Beneath the quiet light of the moon, he spoke of law. Beneath the bright light of day, he spoke of unity. He welcomed envoys from distant lands, their robes bright with the colors of their homes. He listened, he spoke, and he built a city that was not just a place of kings, but a place of dreams, and in the cool shade of Persepolis, the world seemed to whisper of peace, the Persian wars a shadow in the west, but even the greatest of empires cast shadows. Far to the west, beyond the mountains, beyond the rivers, there lay a land of fierce hearts and free spirits, Greece. Its cities were small, its people proud, and they spoke of freedom. At first, the whispers of the Greeks were just that, whispers. But beneath the cool shade of Persepolis, those whispers became a storm. The Greek cities spoke of defiance, of a world where no man was a slave, where kings did not rule by iron, but by choice. Darius, who had brought order to the world, who had built roads that touched the horizon, now spoke of conquest. His armies marched, their banners bright against the sky, their spears like a sea of silver. The mountains of Marathon rose against them, and beneath the fierce light of the sun, the Persians were turned back. But even as the shadows stretched, Darius did not falter. He spoke of strength, of a world where all would bow before the light of Persia. His ships sailed the blue waters of the Aegean, their sails bright beneath the sky. His soldiers marched along the quiet roads, their swords a promise of victory. Yet, in the mountains and the islands, the Greeks whispered of freedom. And in the narrow straits of Salamis, where the sea whispered beneath the wind, the dream of conquest turned to ash. But even as the shadows stretched across the west, the heart of Persia still beat strong. Beneath the light of the sun, the rivers whispered of peace. Beneath the quiet shade of Persepolis, the gardens bloomed. And in the grand halls, the voice of Darius still spoke of a world bound together by law and wisdom, for even in the shadow of defeat there is light, and in the heart of Persia, beneath the watchful mountains, the dream of Darius lived on, a dream of a golden empire. Chapter 13. Alexander the Great, the Conqueror's Dream, in the green, rolling hills of Macedon, where the cool winds whispered through the tall grass, and the olive trees stretched their silver leaves toward the sun. A boy was born, a boy who had changed the world. His name was Alexander. Alexander was not just a child of kings. He was a child of dreams. His father, King Philip II, was a warrior who had forged a powerful kingdom with iron and ambition. But even in his father's shadow, Alexander's gaze stretched farther beyond the mountains of Macedon, beyond the blue waves of the Aegean, to the farthest edges of the world. As a boy, he studied beneath the shade of ancient trees. His teacher was Aristotle, a man whose wisdom was a lantern in the darkness, whose words spoke of stars and stones, of gods and men. From Aristotle, Alexander learned of philosophy, of reason, of the nature of power. But even as he listened, even as he spoke of logic and virtue, his heart whispered of something more. He was a prince, but he was not content to sit within palace walls. He trained with the sword and the spear, his strength growing with each passing year. He rode his horse Bucephalus, a mighty black steed that others had feared, but that he had tamed with a calm hand and a quiet voice. And even as a child, he spoke of greatness, not just of ruling Macedon, but of a world united beneath his banner. When his father was struck down, the crown fell to Alexander, but it was not just a crown of gold. It was a crown of dreams, a crown of ambition. He was not just a king, he was a conqueror waiting to be born. The young king spoke of the stars, of lands beyond the mountains, of a world where his name would be whispered in awe. His generals whispered of caution, his elders spoke of wisdom, but Alexander did not listen. He saw only the horizon, and in that distant line, he saw a promise of greatness, and so, beneath the bright light of the Macedonian sun, a boy became a king, and a king became a dreamer. The fall of Persia, but Alexander's dreams were not content to rest in Macedon. They stretched beyond the mountains, beyond the blue waters of the Aegean, to the wide plains of Asia. There, beneath the golden sun, lay Persia, a vast empire, a world of silver and stone, ruled by Darius III. The armies of Alexander marched like a storm. His soldiers wore bright armor, their spears glittered beneath the light of day, their shields locked like a wall of iron. Beneath the banner of the golden sun, they crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strip of sea that marked the edge of the known world. And beyond it lay a world waiting to be claimed. At Granicus, they met the Persian satraps, fierce warriors who whispered of strength. But their whispers became cries as Alexander's cavalry swept through their lines, his soldiers striking like thunder. The river ran red, and the world of Persia trembled, but this was only the beginning. Across the wide plains of Mesopotamia, the thunder of hooves echoed. At Issus, Alexander met Darius himself, the great king whose armies stretched like a sea of silver. Yet even the might of Persia could not stand against the dream of the young king. Darius fled, his chariots crushed beneath the iron boots of the Macedonian phalanx, and then at Gaugamela the world turned. Beneath the open sky, where the desert winds whispered and the dust rose like smoke, Alexander's soldiers clashed with the might of Persia. The earth trembled beneath the charge of chariots. The sky echoed with the cries of battle. But in the chaos, Alexander's voice rose like a promise. His soldiers marched, their shields locked, their spears thrust forward like the teeth of a beast. Darius fled, his armies shattered. And as the sun set over the silent plains, the gates of Babylon swung open. The golden city, the jewel of Mesopotamia, bowed before the young king. Its temples were silent, its streets whispered of wonder. And in the shadow of its great ziggurat, Alexander stood, a king who had claimed an empire. But for Alexander, this was only the beginning, the conquest of the east beyond the mountains of Persia, beyond the wide rivers and the quiet plains. Alexander's dream stretched farther. He spoke not just of Asia, but of the world. His armies marched across the dry sands of Iran, their footsteps a quiet whisper beneath the bright sun. They climbed the cold passes of the Hindu Kush, their breath misting in the thin air, their eyes set upon a land of mystery, India, here, beneath the shadow of the green jungles, where the rivers flowed wide and the air was sweet with the scent of rain. The armies of Alexander met new wonders and new trials. His men, who had marched across deserts and mountains, now carved their path through dense forests, their swords flashing beneath the thick leaves. They crossed the wide waters of the Hydaspes, their ships gliding beneath the gray sky. The banks of the river, they met a king whose elephants charged like mountains of iron, whose soldiers fought with quiet fury. Yet even in this distant land, the dream of Alexander did not falter. His cavalry swept across the field, his soldiers marched with iron resolve. The king of India bowed, his warriors laid down their swords, but even the greatest of dreams can grow heavy. Alexander's men, who had followed him across the world, who had marched beneath the shadow of mountains and the light of deserts, now spoke not of conquest, but of home. Their faces were lined with weariness, their eyes whispered of distant fields and quiet shores. And even Alexander, who spoke of the world beyond, saw in their eyes a quiet truth. His dream had reached its edge. His men turned back, and beneath the quiet light of the stars, the armies of Alexander began their long journey home, the death of a legend, but even the greatest of kings must one day rest. In the grand palace of Babylon, where the walls shimmered beneath the warm light of the sun, where the gardens bloomed beneath the whispering waters, Alexander's dream ended. A fever swept over him, a quiet shadow that stole his strength. His voice, which had commanded armies, now whispered in the cool darkness of his chamber. His hands, which had held the reins of empires, now lay quiet beneath the soft light. His generals gathered around him, their faces shadowed with fear. And Alexander, who had spoken of the world, now spoke of nothing. His final whispers faded. Beneath the vaulted ceilings, his eyes closed beneath the shadow of the grand hall. The world he had conquered shattered. His generals, who had marched beneath his banner, now whispered of power. They carved his empire apart like hungry wolves, each claiming a piece of his dream. But even as the world he had built crumbled, his name lived on. In the quiet streets of Babylon, in the shadowed hills of Macedon, in the green fields of Persia, they spoke of Alexander, the young king who had reached for the stars, the conqueror whose dream had touched the world. His tomb stood silent, a place of cool shadow and quiet stone. Flowers bloomed beneath the warm sun, and the rivers whispered of his name. The man who had spoken of greatness, who had marched to the edge of the world, now rested in silence, but his dream did not die. It lived on in the whispers of poets, in the songs of soldiers, in the quiet prayers of kings who spoke of his strength. Alexander the Great, the eternal conqueror, the boy who had seen the world, the king who had touched the stars, and beneath the quiet light of the moon, the rivers of Mesopotamia still whispered his name, a name that would never be forgotten. Chapter 14. The Seleucid Empire, the Hellenistic East. In the quiet shadow of Alexander's death, a great dream fractured. The conqueror who had touched the edges of the world now lay silent beneath the vaulted ceilings of Babylon. His voice, which had once spoken of unity, of a world bound together beneath one banner, was now a whisper lost in the cool darkness of the grand halls. And in that silence, his generals spoke not of unity, but of division. They were men who had marched beneath his banner, who had whispered of greatness, who had watched as the world bowed before the young king. But now they spoke not of dreams, but of power. The empire of Alexander was too vast for one man, too wide for one crown. So they drew lines upon the map, lines that would become walls, lines that would become scars. Ptolemy took Egypt, a land of golden temples and silent deserts. Antigonus claimed Asia Minor, where the mountains rose beneath the blue sky. Lysimachus seized Thrace, a land of forests and cold winds. And in the east, where the rivers whispered beneath the warm light of the sun, where the mountains of Persia stood like silent guardians, there rose a new name, Seleucus. Seleucus was not just a general. He was a dreamer, a man who spoke not of chaos, but of order. From the wide plains of Mesopotamia to the distant lands of Persia, he claimed the eastern lands of Alexander's empire. Here, in the shadow of ancient ziggurats, beneath the cool waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, he built something new. Seleucus did not simply conquer. He embraced. He spoke of Greek wisdom, but he did not silence the whispers of the old gods. In the grand halls of Babylon, priests chanted hymns to Marduk, while in the quiet temples of Cilicia, philosophers spoke of Aristotle. Greek columns rose beside ancient ziggurats, their marble bright against the warm stone. The scent of incense curled through the air, a bridge between two worlds. This was not just an empire of iron. It was an empire of thought, of faith, of dreams. A place where the wisdom of Greece touched the soul of Persia. A place where the voice of Seleucus was not a command, but a promise, and in the quiet streets of Babylon, in the cool shade of palm trees, the world whispered of a new age, the age of the Hellenistic East, the city of Seleucia. But even a dream needs a home. For Seleucus, that home was Cilicia, a city of marble and gold, a city that rose upon the banks of the Tigris, where the river whispered beneath the light of the sun. Cilicia was not just a city. It was a promise, a place where east and west could meet, where the old could touch the new. The streets of Cilicia stretched wide, paved with smooth stones that shimmered beneath the sunlight. Along these streets, merchants walked, their stalls filled with silver and silk, spices and scrolls. They spoke 100 tongues, their voices a quiet hum beneath the blue sky. Caravans from distant lands brought treasures from India, incense from Arabia, fine glass from Egypt. In the shadowed markets, the scent of cinnamon mingled with the sweet perfume of roses. Temples rose like mountains of marble, their columns bright against the sky. Greek temples dedicated to Zeus stood beside ancient ziggurats where priests whispered to the gods of summer. Statues of Apollo shimmered beneath the sunlight, while the shadowed halls of Ishtar echoed with quiet prayers. Here, the old gods were not forgotten. They were simply joined by new ones, but Cilicia was not just a city of trade and faith. It was a city of wisdom. Scholars walked beneath the cool shade of palm trees, their robes flowing like shadows. They spoke of Aristotle and Plato, of the stars that danced in the night sky, of the nature of man and the whispers of the soul. In quiet halls, scribes pressed the reeds into damp clay, preserving the thoughts of poets and kings. The Tigris flowed like silver beneath the warm light, its waters carrying the dreams of the world. Ships sailed its quiet current, their sails bright against the sky, their cargo a promise of distant lands. The city was a bridge between east and west, a place where the thoughts of Greece touched the heart of Persia. And in the quiet evenings, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, the streets of Cilicia whispered of a world where the old and the new danced together beneath the light of the stars, the struggle for power, but even the greatest of dreams can tremble. Beneath the warm light of the Hellenistic sun, beneath the quiet whispers of the Tigris, there was a shadow. The shadow of ambition, the shadow of greed. For even an empire born of a dream is not free of the weight of power, the kings of the Seleucid. Empire spoke of unity, but they whispered of conquest. From the wide plains of Mesopotamia to the mountains of Persia, they fought not just against enemies, but against each other. Brothers who should have ruled as one became rivals. Generals who should have spoken of peace now whispered of crowns. In the east, the Parthians rose fierce horsemen who rode beneath the shadow of the mountains. Their arrows whispered like a cold wind. Their voices spoke of freedom. The eastern borders of the Seleucid Empire bled. Villages burned beneath the light of distant fires. And even as the kings of Cilicia spoke of glory, their lands slipped away beneath the shadow of Parthia, but the struggles did not end with the Parthians. In the west, the cities of Greece whispered of independence. The kings of Egypt, the Ptolemies, spoke of empire, their eyes set upon the lands of the east. Even within the grand halls of Cilicia, the voice of loyalty was drowned beneath the whisper of ambition. Kings rose, and kings fell. Thrones became prizes, crowns became shadows. And the dream of Seleucus, the dream of a world where East and West could live as one, began to fray like a banner caught in the wind, for even the brightest of stars can cast shadows, the twilight. Of the Seleucids and the end, even the greatest of empires must fade. The Seleucid Empire, which had once stretched from the mountains of Persia to the shores of the Mediterranean, now stood like a fading shadow beneath the light of the rising sun. One by one, the great cities of the east slipped away, their walls whispering of defiance, their streets silent beneath the weight of fear. Parthia, which had once been a distant threat, now stood as a rising power. Its horsemen swept across the plains, their banners bright beneath the open sky. The mountains became a shield, the deserts a fortress. And the kings of the Seleucids, who had once spoken of glory, now whispered of survival. In the quiet halls of Cilicia, the light of wisdom flickered. The scholars who had spoken of Aristotle now whispered of war. The merchants who had once filled the markets now spoke of empty streets. The temples, which had once been filled with the scent of incense, now stood silent beneath the cold shadow of doubt. But even as the empire trembled, the dream did not die. For even as the kings of Cilicia whispered of power, the streets of the city still whispered of hope. The scholars still spoke of wisdom, the priests still whispered their prayers, and the quiet waters of the Tigris still carried the dreams of the world. Yet the light of the Hellenistic East flickered. The grand halls of Cilicia, which had once shimmered beneath the warm light of the sun, now stood quiet beneath the shadow of twilight. The roads that had carried the thoughts of Greece and the faith of Persia now stretched empty beneath the open sky, but even in the silence there was a whisper of a world where East and West had danced together, where the old and the new had shared a quiet dream. A whisper of a city where the thoughts of philosophers and the prayers of priests had risen like a quiet song beneath the stars, for even in the shadow of an empire's fall, there is a light that cannot be forgotten. And in the quiet streets of Cilicia, in the silent halls of Babylon, the dream of the Hellenistic East lived on a memory of a world that had once whispered of unity. Chapter 15. The Parthian Empire lords of the desert in the barren mountains of Iran, where the cold winds swept across rocky peaks, and the dry earth whispered beneath the sun, there rose a people fierce as the winds themselves, the Parthians. They were not kings by birth, but they were lords by spirit. Warriors who did not speak of palaces or thrones, but of freedom and strength, the Parthians were horsemen. Their lives were not spent behind city walls, but beneath the open sky. They rode swift horses fierce, agile steeds whose hooves danced across the dry earth. Their bows were light but deadly. Their arrows flew like whispers of death. They did not march in iron ranks like the soldiers of empires. They swept like the wind, striking and fading, a storm of speed and steel. The Parthians were a people of the mountains, but their gaze stretched beyond the cold peaks. Beneath the quiet shadow of the hills, their chiefs spoke of power, of a world that trembled beneath the iron grip of distant kings. Persia, which had once been a land of glory, now lay beneath the shadow of foreign rulers. The Greeks of Cilicia whispered of wisdom, but their strength was a fading dream, and so, from the quiet mountain passes, the Parthians rode not as conquerors, but as liberators. They swept across the plains, their horses moving like shadows. Beneath the open sky, cities that had once whispered of Greek gods now spoke of Parthian lords. Temples that had sung of Apollo now whispered of Mithra, the ancient light of Persia. The Parthian kings did not speak of grand empires. They spoke of freedom. They did not carve their names into marble. They carved them into the hearts of their people. And their throne was not a palace, but a saddle. Their crown was not gold, but the wind that touched their faces as they rode. The dream of Persia lived again, but it was a dream born of speed and strength, of men who spoke not of crowns, but of courage. And beneath the light of the sun, the Parthians became more than just a whisper in the mountains. They became lords of the desert, the wars with Rome, but even the greatest of warriors cannot ride alone. To the west, beyond the mountains, beyond the rivers, there rose another power, Rome. It was a city of iron, a city of legions, where soldiers marched in perfect lines, their shields locked like the walls of a fortress. Rome was a city that did not speak of peace. It spoke of conquest. The Romans looked east, and they saw a world of wealth, a world of silver and spice, of silks and fine jewels, a world that seemed to wait beneath the shadow of their eagles. And so, beneath the bright light of the sun, the legions marched. Their iron sandals struck the dry earth. Their banners rose like the wings of eagles. They spoke not of friendship, but of empire, but the Parthians were not a people who bowed. At Cary, where the hot wind whispered across the dry plains, the two worlds met. The Romans marched in iron ranks, their shields locked, their spears thrust forward like a wall of teeth. But the Parthians did not march. They rode, their horsemen swept across the field, their arrows flew like rain. They did not stand and fight. They danced. They rode forward, then vanished, their arrows striking like whispers. The Roman legions, who had conquered the world with iron and discipline, now stood like a beast caught in a net. And one by one they fell. The Parthian general, Sumer, rode at the head of his warriors. His voice was calm, his gaze cold. The Roman general, Crassus, who had spoken of wealth and power, now whispered of fear. Beneath the open sky, beneath the quiet light of the sun, the dream of Roman conquest turned to dust. But even as the Romans fell, the war did not end. For Rome did not forget. Again and again, their legions marched. Again and again, the Parthians rode. The Tigris became a border, a river of whispers, a line between two worlds. The Romans spoke of iron, the Parthians spoke of freedom. And beneath, the open sky, the desert winds carried the echoes of their struggle. The wars between Rome and Parthia were not just battles. They were a clash of worlds, a world of iron and legions, and a world of speed and shadow, the Silk Road and trade. But even as swords clashed beneath the desert sun, there was another world, a world of peace, a world of trade. The Parthians were not just warriors. They were merchants, men who did not simply ride, but who carried the dreams of the world along quiet roads. The Silk Road stretched like a silver thread across the wide plains, across the mountains, through the silent deserts. It was not just a path. It was a promise that even in a world of war, there could be beauty. From the cities of China, where the silks shimmered beneath the light of the moon, to the markets of Rome, where silver coins flashed beneath the warm sun, the Silk Road carried more than just treasures. It carried whispers merchants traveled. Beneath the open sky, their caravans heavy with fine silk, bright spices, sweet incense, and silver. In the quiet cities of Parthia, in Hecatopolis, in Ctesiphon, in Ecbatana, the markets whispered with 100 tongues. The scent of cinnamon mingled with the sweet perfume of roses. Jewels glittered beneath the soft light of lanterns. Scholars spoke of stars, priests whispered of gods, and merchants spoke of wealth. The Parthians did not simply fight. They traded. They spoke not just of swords, but of silver. They did not simply ride to conquer. They rode to connect. The world did not simply know them as warriors. It knew them as merchants, as men who carried the thoughts of the East to the West, and the dreams of the West to the East, and beneath the quiet light of the stars. The Silk Road whispered of a world where even the fiercest of lords could speak of peace, the decline of Parthia, but even the swiftest horse must one day tire. The Parthian Empire, which had once risen like a storm beneath the open sky, now stood beneath a shadow. The kings of Parthia, who had once spoken of freedom, now whispered of power. They spoke not of unity, but of ambition. Brothers who should have ruled as one became rivals. Kings who should have spoken of strength now spoke of fear. In the mountains of Iran, in the quiet halls of Ctesiphon, there was a shadow, the shadow of division. The Parthian lords who had once ridden beneath a single banner now spoke of crowns. The great houses of the empire whispered of power, and the voice of the king became a whisper lost beneath the weight of pride. But even as the Parthian kings whispered of power, another voice rose. The Sassanids, fierce warriors who spoke of Persia's ancient light, rose like a shadow in the mountains. Their banners spoke not of division, but of unity. Their kings did not speak of ambition. They spoke of faith. The Parthian kings, who had once swept across the plains, now stood like shadows beneath the rising sun. Their armies faltered, their cities whispered of fear. And one by one, the great cities of the empire slipped away, there. Walls silent beneath the desert wind. In the end, the Parthian Empire did not fall with a cry. It faded with a whisper. The desert winds, which had once carried the thunder of hooves, now carried only silence. The great halls of Ctesiphon, which had once echoed with the voices of kings, now stood quiet beneath the shadow of time. But even as the Parthian light faded, There was a whisper of warriors who had danced with the wind, of merchants who had carried the dreams of the world, of kings who had spoken of freedom, and beneath the quiet light of the stars, the desert. Winds still whispered of the Parthians, the lords of the desert. Chapter 16. The Sassanid Empire, a Persian Renaissance, in the quiet shadow of mountains, where the winds whispered through dry valleys, and the rivers carved their paths through ancient stones, there stirred a dream of Persia. It was a dream born not of kings, but of faith, of fire, of ancient whispers that spoke of light and truth. And at the heart of this dream stood a man Ardashir. Ardashir was not born to a throne. He was born to the sacred fires, the son of a priest, a man who walked in the quiet shadow of Zoroastrian temples. But even as he whispered prayers to Ahura Mazda, the god of light, his eyes were set on a world beyond the temple walls. For Ardashir saw more than just a place of faith. He saw a land that had forgotten its strength, a people who whispered of greatness, but lived in the shadow of foreign lords, the Parthian Empire, which had once spoken of freedom, now stood like a crumbling tower beneath the weight of greed. Its kings whispered of power, but its cities whispered of fear. Brothers who should have ruled together now spoke of crowns. Warriors who should have marched beneath one banner now whispered of betrayal. But in the quiet halls of Persia, in the shadowed temples where the sacred fires burned, there rose a voice that spoke not of power, but of unity. Ardashir did not speak of gold. He spoke of honor. He did not speak of conquest. He spoke of faith. And beneath the light of the rising sun, warriors gathered beneath his banner, a banner that spoke not of shadows, but of light. His rise was not gentle. The Parthian lords did not bow without a fight. But even as their armies marched, even as their swords struck beneath the light of the sun, the dream of Ardashir did not falter. His voice was a promise. His sword was a reminder. City by city, plain by plain, the old lords fell, their crowns lost in the dust, and in the quiet shadow of Ctesiphon, beneath the tall mountains, Ardashir was crowned not just as a king, but as a dream of Persia restored, a dream of fire and faith, of strength and wisdom. The world that had whispered of chaos now whispered of hope. From the ashes of Parthia rose the Sassanid Empire, a world where the light of Persia burned once more, the great kings of Persia. But a dream does not end with one man. From the quiet halls of Ctesiphon, beneath the warm light of the sun, the Sassanid kings spoke not just of power, but of greatness. And their names became whispers that danced across the mountains. Shapur-ai, the son of Ardashir, was not just a king. He was a conqueror, a ruler who saw the world not as a place of peace, but as a place of strength. Beneath his banner, the armies of Persia marched, their spears bright beneath the sunlight, their banners a sea of red and gold. To the west, Rome whispered of empire. But even the legions of Rome trembled beneath the shadow of Shapur. The Battle of Edessa, Shapur did not simply defeat the Romans. He shattered them. The Roman Emperor Valerian, a man whose name had once echoed across the world, now bowed before him a prisoner, a shadow of his former glory. The world whispered of the strength of Persia, of a king whose voice was a promise, whose sword was a shadow, but the strength of Persia was not just in its armies. It was in its wisdom, its beauty, its faith. The cities of the Sassanids did not simply stand as fortresses. They stood as wonders. Ctesiphon, with its grand halls and shining domes, rose like a jewel beneath the warm light of the sun. The gardens of Persia bloomed beneath the cool shade of tall trees, their flowers bright against the blue sky, and beneath the shadow of the mountains there rose a king whose name would echo across the ages: Khosrow Anushirvan, Khosrow the Just. He did not speak of conquest. He spoke of law, of wisdom, of a world where kings did not rule by fear, but by justice. Scholars gathered in his halls, poets whispered of stars, and the law was not a weapon, but a promise the Sassanid kings spoke, not just of power, but of greatness. They were more than conquerors. They were dreamers. They were the light of Persia, the whisper of a world where strength and wisdom walked hand in hand, the eternal flame Zoroastrian faith, but even the greatest. Of kings are but shadows beneath the light of the sacred flame. For the Sassanid Empire was more than just a land of swords and cities. It was a land of faith, a land where the sacred fires of Zoroastrianism burned a light that spoke of truth, of wisdom, of a world where good and evil danced beneath the open sky. In the quiet halls of the fire temples, where the scent of incense curled through the air, priests whispered their prayers to Ahura Mazda, the god of light and truth. They spoke of a world where the light fought against the shadow, where the righteous walked beneath the quiet glow of the sacred flame. The fire was not just a symbol. It was a promise that even in a world of darkness, there could be light. The priests, dressed in white robes, tended the sacred fires, their voices rising in soft, ancient hymns. Beneath the shadowed mountains, the fires burned, their glow a whisper of a world beyond the shadows. But Zoroastrianism was more than just a faith. It was a way of life. It spoke of honesty, of kindness, of strength. It spoke of a world where kings were not tyrants, but protectors, where the strong did not simply conquer, they served. And in the grand halls of Ctesiphon, beneath the light of the sacred flame, the kings of the Sassanids did not simply speak of power. They spoke of truth. They did not simply wear crowns. They bore the weight of faith. The light of Persia was not just the light of gold and silver. It was the light of the sacred flame, a light that whispered of a world where even in the darkness there could be hope. The fall of the Sassanids, but even the greatest of lights can fade. The Sassanid Empire, which had once risen like a dream, beneath the warm light of the sun, now stood beneath a shadow. From the deserts of Arabia, where the wind whispered across the endless sands, a new voice rose, a voice that spoke not of fire, but of faith, Islam, a faith born in the quiet shadow. Of Mecca, now swept across the desert like a storm. Beneath the banners of the Prophet Muhammad's followers, warriors rode with a promise of unity, of faith, of a world where all would bow before one God. The armies of Islam did not simply march. They swept. The great cities of the Sassanid Empire, which had once whispered of wisdom and strength, now trembled. At the Battle of Qadisiyah, the Persian army broke beneath the storm. The great palaces of Ctesiphon, which had once shone with the light of gold, now stood silent beneath the cold shadow of defeat. But even as the Sassanid kings whispered of courage, even as their warriors spoke of honor, the shadow grew. One by one, the cities of Persia fell. One by one, the light of the Sassanids faded. And in the quiet halls of Ctesiphon, beneath the silent stars, the voice of Persia was lost. But even as the world of the Sassanids faded, their light did not die. For their faith, their wisdom, their dreams did not simply vanish. The sacred fires, of Zoroastrianism still burned. The poetry of Persia still whispered beneath the quiet light of the moon. And in the silent mountains, the voice of the Sassanid kings lived on, for even in the shadow of their fall, the Sassanids were not just an empire. They were a dream of a world where light stood against darkness, where kings were more than conquerors, where faith was a promise, and beneath the quiet stars. The rivers of Persia still whispered their ancient song, a song of a world where the light of Persia once burned bright. Chapter 17. The Rise of Islam, the Dawn of a New Era, in the silent sands of Arabia, beneath a sky of burning blue, there rose a voice that spoke not of power, but of faith. It was a voice born not in the halls of kings, but in the quiet shadow of a mountain, in the stillness of a cave. His name was Muhammad, a man of the Quraysh tribe, a man who walked beneath the quiet stars, a man who listened to the whisper of the divine dot. It began in the darkness. A quiet moment beneath the cold stone, where the only sound was the quiet breath of the desert wind. But in that darkness there was light, a light that spoke not of shadows, but of truth. Recite came the command, and Muhammad's voice rose. Soft but clear, his heart trembling beneath the weight of the words, his message was simple, but it was aflame. It spoke of one God, Allah, the most merciful, the most just. It spoke of faith, of unity, of a world where the strong did not oppress the weak, where the rich did not ignore the poor. It spoke of justice beneath the light of the stars, of mercy beneath the shadow of the mountains, but even the brightest light can cast shadows. In the holy city of Mecca, where the great stone Kaaba stood beneath the open sky, the voice of Muhammad was not met with joy. The merchants who whispered of wealth spoke of fear. The chiefs who spoke of power spoke of defiance. They saw not a prophet, but a challenge. Muhammad and his followers were mocked, scorned, driven from their homes. They fled to the city of Medina, a city of palm groves and quiet wells, a city that whispered of peace. And here, beneath the warm light of the sun, the voice of Muhammad became a promise. His words were not just a whisper. They became a call to faith, to justice, to a world where men were not measured by wealth, but by their hearts. Tribes that had once fought over dry sands now spoke of brotherhood. Warriors who had once whispered of blood now spoke of peace, and beneath the quiet sky, the words of Muhammad became a flame that spread beyond the deserts, beyond the mountains. To the farthest edges of the world, the conquest of Mesopotamia, but even the greatest of words, are carried by the wind. And beneath the shadow of the mountains, the words of Muhammad became more than just a promise. They became a force. From the deserts of Arabia, where the hot wind whispered across the endless sands, there rose an army that did not speak of wealth, but of faith. The armies of Islam did not march for gold. They marched for belief. Beneath the banner of the crescent moon, they swept across the lands of Mesopotamia, where the slow, silver waters of the Tigris whispered beneath the warm light of the sun. The cities of the Sassanids, which had once spoken of power, now stood silent beneath the shadow of a new faith. Ctesiphon, the great palace of the Sassanid kings, stood like a dream beneath the quiet sky. Its domes shimmered in the sunlight. Its gardens bloomed beneath the cool shade of tall trees. But even the grandest of palaces can tremble. The walls of Ctesiphon fell. Its halls whispered of fear. The great throne of the Sassanid kings stood empty, its shadow a quiet memory beneath the quiet stars, the rivers of Mesopotamia, which had once whispered of kings and warriors, now whispered of prayer. The call to prayer rose above the quiet plains, a voice that spoke not of crowns, but of faith. The fertile fields, which had once whispered of wealth, now whispered of peace, but the conquest of Mesopotamia was not a conquest of swords. It was a conquest of hearts. The farmers who worked the fields, the merchants who filled the markets, the priests who whispered their ancient prayers, they did not lose their homes. They did not lose their faiths. They lived beneath the shadow of a new world, a world that spoke of mercy, of justice, of faith, and in the quiet shadow of the palm trees, in the cool light of the morning, the rivers of Mesopotamia whispered of a new era, the golden age of Baghdad. But the world of Islam was not just a world of swords. It was a world of wisdom, of light, of dreams. And at the heart of this world stood a city that rose like a jewel upon the banks of the Tigris. Its name was Baghdad, the city of peace. Under the Abbasid caliphs, Baghdad was more than just a city. It was a beacon. Beneath the warm light of the sun, its streets whispered of knowledge, its markets shimmered with treasures. Scholars gathered in its quiet halls, their voices a quiet hum beneath the cool shade. They spoke of stars and stones, of medicine and mathematics. They spoke of a world where wisdom was a light, where knowledge was a gift. At the heart of this world stood the house of wisdom, a grand hall of light and shadow, a place where the thoughts of the world were gathered like a quiet sea. Here, beneath the soft glow of lanterns, scholars translated the ancient texts of Greece and Rome, the whispers of India, the wisdom of Persia. Here, poets spoke of love, of loss, of stars that danced in the silent sky. But Baghdad was more than just a place of wisdom. It was a place of beauty. Its gardens bloomed beneath the soft light of dawn. Flowers of every color danced in the breeze. Its fountains whispered beneath the cool shade, their waters clear and cool. Merchants filled its markets, their stalls, bright with silk, with silver, with spices that carried the scent of distant lands, and beneath the light of the moon, as the stars danced above the quiet city, poets recited their verses. Their words rose like a soft breeze, their voices a quiet song beneath the silent sky. Baghdad was not just a city. It was a dream of a world where faith and wisdom walked hand in hand, where the light of knowledge shone brighter than the light of swords, the decline of the Abbasids. But even the brightest of lights can cast shadows. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had once risen like a beacon upon the banks of the Tigris, now stood beneath a shadow. The halls of Baghdad, which had once whispered of wisdom, now whispered of power. Factionalism stirred within the grand halls. The caliphs who had once spoken of peace now whispered of power. The provinces of the caliphate, which had once spoken of unity, now whispered of rebellion. The armies which had once marched beneath a single banner now marched beneath 1,000. But even as the whispers of division grew, a greater shadow rose. From the distant east, where the mountains stood like silent guardians, there rode a storm, the Mongols. Beneath the banner of Genghis Khan, they swept across the world like a cold wind. Cities that had once whispered of peace now trembled. Beneath the thunder of hooves, Baghdad, the city of peace, the city of wisdom, stood proud against the coming storm. Its walls rose like mountains of stone. Its rivers whispered beneath the quiet sky. but even the strongest of walls can tremble. In 1258, the Mongols swept across the plains, their swords bright beneath the gray light. The grand libraries of Baghdad, which had once held the wisdom of the world, now burned. The rivers ran black with ink, the silent halls whispered of shadows, the caliph was cast down, the city was shattered, the gardens that had once bloomed. Beneath the soft light of dawn now stood silent beneath the cold shadow of ruin, but even as the light of Baghdad faded, its dream did not die. For the wisdom of the scholars, the words of the poets, the whispers of the house of wisdom, these could not be silenced, and beneath the quiet stars, the rivers of Mesopotamia still whispered of a city that had once been a beacon, a city that had spoken of peace, of faith, of knowledge, for even in the shadow of the Mongol storm, the dream of Baghdad lived on a light that could never be forgotten. Chapter 18. The Mongol invasion, the storm of destruction, from the cold, endless steppes of Asia, where the grass danced beneath the cold wind, and the sky stretched wide and gray, there rose a shadow. It was a shadow of iron and fire, of speed and fury. It was a shadow that whispered of death. And at its heart rode a name that would echo across the world, Genghis Khan. The Mongols were not a people of cities or temples. They were a people of the open sky, of the wild plains where the wind sang beneath the quiet stars. Their strength was not in walls or palaces. It was in their horses, their bows, their fierce hearts. Beneath the quiet light of the moon, they moved like shadows. Beneath the bright light of the sun, they struck like thunder. Genghis Khan was not just a conqueror. He was a storm. Beneath his banner, the Mongol horsemen swept across the world. Their arrows flew like rain. Their swords struck like lightning. City after city fell before them. Their walls crumbled beneath the roar of hooves. Their streets ran red beneath the iron boots of the riders, and in the lands of Khwarezm, where the deserts whispered beneath the open sky, the storm struck with fury. Cities burned beneath the shadow of smoke. Their towers crumbled beneath the weight of fire. The rivers which had once whispered of life now flowed with ash and sorrow. Fields that had once bloomed beneath the warm light of the sun now lay silent beneath a gray sky, but the storm did not stop. The Mongols swept onward, their banners bright against the sky, their voices a quiet promise, a promise of destruction. And beyond the mountains, beyond the rivers, there lay a land of ancient whispers, a land of fertile fields and sacred cities, Mesopotamia, the rivers of Mesopotamia, which had once whispered of life, now whispered of fear. The cities which had once sung of wisdom, now trembled. Beneath the quiet sky, beneath the open plains, there came a thunder, the thunder of hooves, for the storm was not just a whisper. It was a promise. And the promise was death, the sack of Baghdad in the year 1258. The world of Islam whispered of beauty, of wisdom, of peace. At the heart of this world stood Baghdad, the city of peace. It was a city of gardens, where flowers bloomed beneath the warm light of the sun. It was a city of knowledge, where scholars whispered of stars, where poets sang of love, where the scent of incense curled through the quiet air, but even the brightest of lights can cast shadows. And beneath the shadow of Baghdad's grand walls, there rose a storm. Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis, led the Mongol horde an army that moved like a dark sea, its banners bright beneath the gray sky, its swords cold and sharp. They marched with iron, but they spoke of fire. They did not whisper of mercy. They spoke of wrath, The walls of Baghdad, which had once stood as silent guardians beneath the light of the moon, now trembled. The gates, which had once welcomed merchants and scholars, now whispered of fear. And beneath the cold sky, the Mongol army waited a silent shadow, a storm that whispered of death. The Caliph, whose voice had once spoken of peace, now spoke of pride. He did not bow. He did not plead. But even the greatest of pride can tremble before the storm. The Mongols breached the walls. They swept through the streets like a river of iron. Their swords flashed beneath the dull light. Their horses struck like thunder. The scholars who had whispered of wisdom now whispered of fear. The merchants who had spoken of wealth now whispered of silence. The soldiers who had spoken of courage now fell beneath the iron boots of the riders. The grand libraries of Baghdad, which had once held the wisdom of the world, now burned. The scent of parchment turned to smoke. The words of poets rose like ash. The rivers of Mesopotamia, which had once whispered of life, now ran black with ink, red with blood. The Tigris, which had once carried the dreams of 1,000 scholars, now whispered of death. The gardens, which had once bloomed beneath the soft light of dawn, now stood silent beneath the cold shadow of ruin. Baghdad, the city of peace, was a graveyard, the aftermath a world in ruins, but even the greatest of storms must pass. The Mongols, who had once swept across the world like a whisper of death, now moved on. Their banners rose beneath the cold light of the sky. Their swords glinted beneath the quiet light. And beneath the shadow of their march, there lay a world of ashes. The fertile plains of Mesopotamia, which had once whispered of life, now lay silent. The fields, which had once bloomed beneath the warm light of the sun, now lay dry and barren. The irrigation canals, which had once carried the silver waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, now whispered of ruin. The rivers, which had once whispered of wisdom, now whispered of sorrow. The cities of Mesopotamia, which had once sung of beauty, now stood like shadows beneath the open sky. Their walls, which had once risen like mountains of stone, now crumbled beneath the quiet wind. Their streets, which had once whispered of merchants and poets, now lay silent beneath the dust. But even in this darkness, there was a whisper of life, a whisper of faith. The mosques, which had once risen like towers of light, still whispered their prayers. The scholars who had once whispered of wisdom now spoke of survival. The poets who had once sung of stars now whispered of shadows. The world of Mesopotamia was not just a world of ruins. It was a world of whispers, whispers of a light that could not be silenced, a wisdom that could not be forgotten. And beneath the quiet light of the moon, the rivers of Mesopotamia still flowed. They flowed not with wealth, but with memory. They whispered not of pride, but of sorrow. But they whispered still the rise of the Ilkhanate, but even the fiercest of conquerors can become builders. The Mongols, who had once spoken of wrath, now whispered of peace. Beneath the shadow of their rule, a new world rose, the Ilkhanate, a land where the sword and the pen walked hand in hand. The Mongol rulers of Persia did not speak only of iron. They spoke of wisdom. They did not destroy. They rebuilt. Hulagus. Descendants embraced Islam, the faith they had once struck down. The sacred mosques, which had once whispered of ruin, now rose once more beneath the light of the sun. The scholars who had once whispered of fear, now whispered of knowledge. The cities of Persia, which had once whispered of sorrow, now whispered of peace. Tabriz became a city of light, where merchants spoke of wealth, where scholars spoke of wisdom. Gardens bloomed beneath the soft shade of tall trees, their flowers bright against the blue sky dot in the quiet halls of the Ilkhanate. Poets whispered of stars, painters spoke of beauty, philosophers spoke of truth. The libraries, which had once burned beneath the shadow of the Mongol storm, now whispered of knowledge. The books that had been lost were rewritten. The dreams that had been shattered were whispered once more. The Mongols, who had once been lords of destruction, now became lords of wisdom. They spoke not just of power, but of beauty. They spoke not just of wrath, but of faith, and in the quiet shadow of their rule, Mesopotamia still breathed. Its fields, which had once whispered of life, now whispered of hope. Its rivers, which had once run black with ink, now whispered of peace, for even in the shadow of destruction there can be light. And beneath the quiet stars, the rivers of Mesopotamia still whispered of a world that had been lost, but not forgotten. The Mongol storm had passed, but the dream of Mesopotamia lived on.